Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, where the hell is it? I wondered, as I navigated my way awkwardly down the craggy country roads of a very inhospitable part of North Carolina, feeling as lost and as insecure as a goldfish in a tank of piranhas. I was a city girl by rights, and had little if any experience of driving down sequestered, uncongenial country roads like this, in the middle of nowhere, without a solitary soul in sight, beyond a faraway farmer's tractor on a field, or a cowboy riding among his steers, seen on the distant horizon, like an obscure figurine on a monopoly board. I was navigating my way awkwardly, rather like a blind man, driving past meadows filled with cows, sheep, frolicking horses, and verdant fields of very well organized and superbly irrigated crops. Then there were the lofty trees, so many of them. They stretched out like a large, all-encompassing yawn, into sprawling wood groves. But beyond that, the discomposing silence of these prepossessing country roads was so deafening. Everything was airily quiet, far too quiet for comfort. And for a city girl like myself, I don't mind admitting it put me distinctly on edge. I could get out of my car and scream at the top of my lungs, and no one would likely hear me for miles around. In the last hour, I had not seen a bicycle, a scooter, a car, or any kind of farming vehicle pass me, which unsettled me greatly, even though I knew the small rural town was not too far away from where I was. Such knowledge offered me very little solace. I felt like a tiny, inconspicuous ant, as the natural world seemed to swallow me up whole, like a large humpback whale. I was comfortable with the busy sidewalks and streets, the honking taxicabs and shrieking buses as they ground to a noisy halt, with billowing smoke from their exhausts punching the air. I was used to the hustle and bustle of Boston's lively coffee bars and diners, filled with the reassuring trills of people's voices that were as comforting to me as the crashing sounds of the ocean waves, as sometimes the sounds of traffic can mimic the sounds of the ocean. I would sink into an upholstered chair gratefully in a coffee bar after having spent a gruelingly hard day at the office and just relax into the rhythmic musical trills of people's voices in the background as I sipped into a hot drink. And then I would walk away feeling soothed and right with the world, almost as if the hiccups of my day at the office had been masterfully ironed away, like a starched shirt, and tomorrow would be a brand new day, with less creases and problematic eruptions arising. And believe me, it usually was. Out here, in the countryside, I felt very much on my own, naked and vulnerable, as if I was running around without my clothes on. It was not a good feeling. My father once argued with me about how much more sensible it was to live in the country, for indeed when he was a boy, he'd grown up in this almost uncharted part of North Carolina, and this remote country road was home turf to him, that he fully appreciated and loved. But to me, there was nothing friendly about an untamed, wild environment that was as unfamiliar to me as the skin on my own back. My father insistently argued that the countryside was so much safer than the city, as he pointed out that wherever you find large congregations of people, there too you will find dangers lying in plain sight, like landmines that have the potential to explode in your hands if you don't handle them with the utmost of care. He said people can be volatile and unpredictable, and wherever there are large gatherings of people, there is a greater potential risk of violent crime, rape, burglary, stabbings, robbery, and even murder. If you move to the remote countryside, far away from people, those problems go away. But do they really? Usually when you walk away from one problem, you walk straight into another one. Suffice to say, I didn't entirely agree with my father's assessment, because where there are people, help is always at hand. One day, for example, on the streets of Boston, as I was waiting patiently at a bus stop, I was reading my messages on my cell phone, and a young man ran past me. He pulled out the cell phone from my hands and sped away from me as fast as he possibly could. But another man on his bicycle, having seen the fortuitous events unfold before his very eyes, interceded on my behalf and knocked down the fleeing man with his bicycle. The man was bumped over and went crashing to the ground with a mighty thud, hitting the sidewalk quite hard. But luckily he escaped without a graze, so no harm was done, and the only thing that was bruised was his ego, after having been caught red-handed, pilfering from the citizens of our university town. I got the profound sense he was a student of some kind, far too lazy to wait tables in a local restaurant for extra cash, and unwisely perceived that stealing people's cell phones might be a profitable little nifty sideline to bring in some much-needed extra cash. I hope his interaction with that bicycle would make him reconsider his new profession. Once he got back on his feet, he abandoned his duffel bag that had popped open on the pavement like a large sack of potatoes, and was hemorrhaging out a plethora of cell phones and an abundance of golf balls that went gliding across the road like the balls on a golfing green. Why there were so many golfing balls in his duffel bag is beyond me. People stopped in the streets of Boston in awe, wondering why there were golf balls rolling all over the road. Ostensibly all the cell phones that had been so obviously stolen were subsequently returned to their grateful owners when I took the duffel bag to the police. The guilty young man was still at large, possibly still preying on people's purses and hiding out on golfing greens to add to his ever-increasing collection of golf balls. But my point is here that there are hard-working, decent Americans around in populated areas, much like that responsible cyclist, the Good Samaritan whose fast actions interceded on my behalf and retrieved my cell phone for me. So even among the dangers of living among too many people in a buzzing, thriving metropolis, there is one guarantee that you can depend on with certainty. Help is always at hand. There's always a rose among the thorns. But out on a lonely country road like this, there are no rose bushes in sight, but there are lots of thorny briars, ready to snag an unsuspecting sleeve. What if there is an unsavoury character lurking behind some trees in the countryside? An escaped prison convict, perhaps, who has lost leave of his senses, who is lying in wait to eagerly entrap you in some guileful, duplicitous way. Who will hear your desperate calls when you call out for help, as this demented, unhinged stranger gives you chase? All that will hear your frantic, desperate cries are the tall, lofty trees, the birds of the air, or some frolicking horses in a field. What if you do manage to escape his clutches, but your cell phone reception is mute? What if you're completely lost? How far will you have to walk on aching, throbbing legs, sagging with exhaustion like a deflated alpine flower, to find a remote farmhouse and a smiling face, willing to give you that helping hand? By all accounts, help could be a long way in coming, and when it arrives, it might be all too late. You hear stories all the time of people mysteriously disappearing all over America, most commonly in remote wilderness locations. But where did they go? What happened to them? We might never find the answers to those enigmatic questions, but someone out there knows what became of those unfortunate people. But much like the silent trees, the meadows and the horses, they're not talking, and those contained secrets are not being carelessly spilled. but are fiercely guarded by those in the know, who do not want even a drop of knowledge seeping out into the general populace. So as I continued on my merry way, driving down these tributary back roads in the remote countryside, my unfit car was not used to such arduous exercise, and only appreciative of the smooth catwalk-like surfaces of Boston roads. It was jolting precariously and shaking tumultuously like a baby's rattle, as it swaggered with the ungainly motions of an intoxicated drunk over dense and deep crevices in the road. In truth, all the jarring jolts and bumps did very little to soothe my rising level of angst, but I had no choice but to be here. I would have loved nothing better than to remain in my safe, very cosy Boston apartment, drinking back a lovely glass of Cabernet Sauvignon and snuggling up to a snug sofa to read a good book. I belonged to a book club where me and my friends would get together in the evenings once a week to discuss the idiosyncratic characters and enigmatic plots in the books we were reading. But this week there would be no exciting book club meetings for me. Forget that. I would be otherwise indisposed, like a butterfly with its pretty wings snagged to a bushy briar, tethered inauspiciously to one spot, through no choice of my own, of course. I would rarely miss not getting together with my girlfriends tonight to discuss the book we were all reading, which was a long way away from the more predictable realities of our daily lives, the perfect escapism, if you like, that I always sought eagerly after a difficult day spent at the office. This month's book was Stephen King's book. It was called Pet Sematary, so let's just say some of the disturbing contents still remained fresh in my mind, and they were not easy to reflect upon when you're travelling on a lonely road, as inauspicious as this one seemed. Little did I comprehend that the moment I got into my car and travelled far away from Boston on a 723-mile road trip, taking easily over 11 hours and 50 minutes to get to my desired destination, that I would soon experience something so idiosyncratic, so bizarre, so outer-worldly, that would make almost the less believable plots in fictional books seem almost as if they were powdered with a large measure of truth. For I was to face something in my real life that bordered along the boundaries of what many might call spurious, only I assure you, there was nothing fictitious about what was soon to happen to me. I glanced around my immediate surroundings, my heart heavy in my chest, for I noticed the sunlight began to fade, dipping over the valley in a golden glaze. It was pretty enough, of course, but everything was becoming more shadowy and obscure, and once that sun melted away, a velvety darkness devoid of any street lights to light up the way would soon set in and take hold, and I didn't want to be stuck out here on this uncongenial road, trying desperately to find my way to my grandfather's place, and I didn't know where the hell it was. In the past, if I took any intrepid off-road trips away from my home in Boston, it was always with my devoted father diligently by my side. He would drive me in his much more agreeable, rather macho Land Rover Discovery that hugged these uncongenial country roads like an old friend, with tyres that welcomed potholes and bumpy dips in the road, as if they were mere superficial scratches, and delighted in frolicking down inauspicious craggy terrain, as if it was no big deal. My car, on the other hand, was a refined, elegant red Alpha Spider that certainly did not appreciate getting her rubber tyres congealed with mud, and was not remotely grateful to be driving on roads as insufferable as this. And frankly, how could I blame her for taking offence? For it was difficult not to feel as if the surrounding countryside was conspiring against me and my car, judging by the way I was being jolted around like a loose apricot in a Tupperware container. My father, who'd been widowed for many years after my mother had died 20 years ago from colon cancer, was now remarried and living far away in Sydney, Australia, with his new wife Cindy, who he met online. He seemed incredibly happy. Ostensibly there was now an ocean between us, but luckily modern technology had kept me close to my dad. You can bet your bottom dollar if my dad was with me right now, it would be him, not me, navigating his way down these ambiguous, less-than-friendly sequestered roads. Why had I agreed to do this for him? I asked myself. Had I completely lost leave of my senses? My father had said to me, "I'll take a flight from Sydney and fly to North Carolina myself. I can't expect you to sort this mess out for me. It's not fair on you, sweetheart." It's one hell of a responsibility for you to take on." I assured him that the problem was sorted, and I would fix it for him. "But are you sure, sweetheart? I mean, you've never even been to the property before. Do you really think you can tidy up after my father? I think I should warn you, he was quite the hoarder, especially after my mother died. Why do you think we were never invited to stay at his farmhouse after your grandmother died? Your grandfather was extremely embarrassed by the mess. My mother always used to tirelessly complain about my father when we were growing up. She didn't call him Sloppy Joe for nothing, you know. She was always cleaning up after him when I was a child. I remember one time he was creating a romantic dinner for my mother, for their 15th wedding anniversary. He insisted on cooking for my mother, and said he was going to make it very special for her. I was 12 years old at the time, and let me tell you, my father spared nothing. He used every available pan, every bowl, every plate, every accessible kitchen gadget to cook for my mother. My mother said when she returned home to that romantic meal that my father had prepared for her as a lovely surprise. The kitchen looked like it was a war zone. Even the oven was smoking. My father was coughing and spluttering from the dense air, and was covered in flour from head to toe. His black beard had turned completely white, and let's just say the terracotta kitchen floor was littered with dirty pots and plates, which our Irish wolfhound Elsa was licking very happily. She was the only one not unhappy about the mess, because she could unleash her tongue into every pan, and our kitchen floor became a playground of tasty popsicles for her. When my father made a simple cake mix, he would transfer it from one bowl to another, creating hundreds of dirty dishes in the process, until he found the correct container that was a perfect fit for the mixture, and then he would transfer it to a tin. He overlooked the fact that in the long, laborious process of searching to find the most suitable size bowl, he had inadvertently used every other available bowl in the kitchen that now would need to be washed and put away. Worse still, he had dropped eggs, flour, potato peelings on the floor, which he decided he would clean up later, but they were being trampled into the floor by his dirty boots. My mother said it took her an entire week to clear up the mess after him, and all for a few burnt measly offerings he managed to cook for her, where the potatoes were, I believe, as hard as bullets, and the meat so shrunken and dry that it tasted like leather. It turned out my father had cooked a side of beef for over 8 hours, when it was supposed to only take 2.5 to cook. He told my mother he'd heard that long, slow cooking was the best for a tender cut of meat, so he thought cremating the side of beef was clearly a good idea, while the potatoes he popped in the oven for less than 30 minutes, so they weren't even cooked. From thenceforth my mother told him in no uncertain terms never to cook again, because he was a liability in the kitchen. "It can't be that bad, surely," I'd said. "Surely he wasn't that cack-handed." "You don't know the half of it," said my father. "Don't get me wrong. My father meant well. His heart was always in the right place. But let's just say his organizational skills left a lot to be desired. That's why he always came to stay with us in Boston for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Don't you remember? He knew my mother would have turned in her grave to see the mess he'd made of their farmhouse. He was so self-conscious about the place that I suspect he was afraid of being judged. I don't think he knew how to clean up after himself. I'm just warning you, sweetheart, that you might be walking into a bomb site. I never went to see him at the farmhouse myself, nor did I pay him any random fortuitous visits. In truth, I was afraid of what I would see. I did not want it to blemish or sour the wistfully nostalgic memories I have of my childhood, by seeing everything in chaotic disarray. One thing I can guarantee you is that you will be going to a mess. The solicitors of the estate warned me as much. Mr. Randall told me it was quite a shocker for him when he ventured into the house. Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to take this job on? It's certainly not for the faint-hearted. Also, the solicitors put my father's ashes on the kitchen window ledge, next to some of the indoor pot plants. So if you could sprinkle them for me in the woodgrove, that would be most appreciated. My father adored those woods. You'll find the key to open the farmhouse under a large terracotta pot containing hanging geraniums, on the porch next to the front door. I gather the solicitors left out a very large dumping container for you, to use to throw away the stuff in my father's house. They left the phone number on the mantel for you to call the company that will pick up the container to take the stuff to the dump when it's full. They left you a plethora of bin bags for the job. You know, the tough kind that don't easily break. They also left you cleaning products and food in the refrigerator. You'll need to stay there for a week to get the job fully done. That's what Mr. Randall believes. He says it's not a job for anyone that abhors hard work. It's not a problem, I'd said, trying to disguise my rising level of doubt, because in truth I was not desirous to take this job on. But as usual, my eagerness to please sabotaged my ability to say no, even to my own father. But my non-existent, assertive boldness shrank into the shadows like a frightened rabbit. All my life I had been a perennial people-pleaser, and that's why in so many things in my life they had gone so badly awry. I had lost beloved boyfriends over my inability to say no to them. They had walked all over me, as if I was a less than valuable piece of trash lying on the floor. I was always agreeing with them, always pleasing them, never wanting to put one foot out of line, even when I surreptitiously disagreed with them. I never wanted to upset the apple cart in any way, or tip over the apples to cause any kind of upheaval or offence. When that happens, people take full advantage of you. They exploit you and lose respect for you. I mean, can you really blame them? It's hard to respect someone who does not appear to hold themselves in high regard, or bother to stand up for themselves, who is too afraid in any way to cause offence or to ruffle feathers, and worse still is fearful to disagree with you, lest you don't like them. The reality, of course, is if you have any opinion that contradicts other people's, you're often admired for speaking out confidently and expressing yourself. I had been a shrinking violet and a do-gooder all my life, the sweet little girl wearing the flowery dress that everyone thinks is so terribly nice, so sickly sweet, so demure, so pretty, so ridiculously pathetic, the kind of person you think will never say boo to a goose and will always fall in line no matter what. I was like that, because I wanted people to like me. Isn't that so tragic? But yes, that was me. I thought saying no would make people turn against me, like a viper in its nest, and I hated confrontation, rebellion, and discord of any kind, and would always avoid it like the plague. It was easier to say yes. Yes was a word that made people smile. It made people naturally like you. But no always brought on sour looks and downcast expressions, and I couldn't bear that. The trouble is underneath the flaky layers of my desire to please everyone that crossed my path. There lay clandestinely buried within me a wild stallion, threatening to bolt through the claustrophobic confinement of my people-pleasing trap, and dying to scream, "No, I will not do it. No, I cannot come to your party. No, I cannot help you make brownies for the school fete. No, I cannot lend you money that you will never ever pay me back. No, I cannot take you out to dinner." It would seem no was a word that required courage, that other people recruited with effortless ease, but not me. Never me. My best friend Paisley had no problem saying the word no, and I admired her all the more for that. One year I'd said yes to sponsoring everyone who asked me to sponsor them for a charity run for the Leukemia Trust. I'm sure people were saying, "Just go to Skye, she'll sponsor you. She's a complete pushover." In the end, I could barely afford to pay for my food shopping that month, because I'd spent all my monthly earnings on that charity run that I could ill afford to sponsor. My friend Paisley, by contrast, masterfully employed the word no with an enviable ease. She would say, "No, I'm sorry, I can't sponsor you." And that was that. Why could I not be more like her? "What's wrong with you, Skye?" she'd say to me. "Why can't you say no to people? It's not hard, you know. Try it sometime." You'll be surprised to find saying no is easier than you actually think it is." When I told her I was doing this cleaning up job for my father, she'd shaken her head in exasperation. "Are you stark raving mad, Skye? Are you telling me you can't even say no to your own dad? You know how ridiculous that sounds. I get you might find saying no to a friend or a stranger rather tough, but a member of your own family? That's completely insane. You should have let him fly over from Australia, for goodness sake, to sort out your grandfather's deceased estate. Why should it be up to you to sort out? You know what you need to do? Phone him now. Tell him you've changed your mind and that sorting your grandfather's mess out is too much for you to take on single-handed. I'm sure he'll understand." "I don't want to let my dad down. I mean, he's in Australia," I told her. "He'd have to trek over from the other side of the globe to fly all the way to North Carolina, when I'm only 11 hours away from the place by car. And I mean, it'll probably take me less than a week to sort out all of this for him. Put it this way, the estate agents refuse to put the property on the market until it's been fully cleaned out. They're happy to sell it furnished, but the place needs to be hoovered and dusted and the trash needs to be thrown away, if you get my drift. So no, I'm not looking forward to it." "I don't understand you, Skye," said Paisley, looking at me incredulously and shaking her short mane of brown curls despairingly. She put a finger on my chest and said, "I know there is a courageous warrior inside you somewhere, Skye. I absolutely believe that. It's very eager to break out of your very nice facade that you keep showing to the world. It's aching to have the guts to say no for once in your life. You're a glutton for punishment, Skye. But maybe it's a good thing you're going to do this for your dad." "Why?" I asked her. "Why is cleaning up somebody else's mess ever a good thing?" Paisley grimaced. "I hate to say this to you, Skye, but you're your own worst enemy. Sometimes when you're thrown into the deep end of somebody else's mess, and you realise you've taken on more than you can chew, you might just say to yourself, 'Why the hell did I agree to do this?' And for once in your life, it might make you have the courage to say no when next time you're asked to do something like this." I reflected on my friend's ominous words, now that I was stuck in the North Carolina countryside, not knowing the hell where I was. I knew Paisley was right. Why had I agreed to do this crazy, nonsensical thing? And now here I was, with no GPS reception, glancing out of my driver's side window, staring out at the unfamiliar scenery, with bemusement rather than appreciation, as the cheery light of the afternoon seemed to be fading pretty fast. My heart felt heavy in my chest as the weight of my anxiety increased its pressure on me. I sighed with relief when I heard the friendly sound of heavy wheels rolling up behind me. Someone had stopped their very robust vehicle and was slamming the truck door and walking over to my driver's side window, crunching the craggy ground beneath heavy booted feet. Seconds later, knuckles banged on the glass of my driver's side window. I pulled down my window and was staring at a friendly face, a face I knew at once I could trust. "Hello there, ma'am. You all right? What you're doing out here on a lonely country road, if you don't mind me asking you? Do you need help? Are you lost?" The man, with his genuinely concerned round face and hazel brown eyes, stared at me earnestly. I felt the colour flush in my cheeks. "I'm afraid I'm lost. I'm looking for Willow Creek Farm. You don't happen to know where it is, do you, by any chance? I think I've been driving around and around in circles, and my GPS reception refuses to give me a signal. I'm a bit concerned because I want to get to the place before it gets dark." "Sorry to hear that, ma'am. That you're lost, I mean. I must confess it's badly signposted around here. The locals know the area very well, so we don't really bother to signpost it. But don't you worry, I will show you exactly where you need to go. It's not far from here, so you will be back at the farmhouse before it's dark. That's a promise. My name is Gus Branning, by the way. And you are?" "I'm Skye MacLeod." "You're related to old Joe MacLeod?" he asked me warmly. "That's right, I'm his granddaughter. I'm here for a few days to sort out his property for the estate agents. They refuse to sell it until it's cleaned up." "I see. Well, it's going to be sad to see the old place being sold. For as long as I've been around, your grandfather has lived there. Joe was a good man. We played chess with each other regularly. Your grandfather came to my farm twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays for chess to be precise. He always joined us for dinner. My wife has had a soft spot for Joe for a very long time. By the way, I'm very sorry for your loss. Everyone misses Joe around here. Still, he lived a good long life, and I will tell you this. He told me that it would be over his dead body that he would move to a retirement home. He wanted to pop his clogs out here on the farm, and that's what happened. It's the best way to go, dying in your sleep, don't you think? I was the one that unfortunately found him when I went to check up on him, as he had not returned my phone call about bridge that evening. His body was still warm when I found him, lying on the sofa. He had only just died. Well, probably been dead for about 45 minutes to an hour or so. Looked so peaceful, he did. I had no idea it was you that found him, I said, looking amazed. Well, we always look out for each other in these parts, don't we? And your grandfather Joe wasn't getting younger, but he was still as strong as an ox when he died, still chopping his own firewood at 91 years old. Now that's not bad. That is impressive, I agreed. Gus paused for a brief moment and said, I'm not entirely sure, if the truth be told, that I really was the first person to find your grandfather deceased. Someone got there first, before me. What do you mean? I asked incredulously. Well, I probably should not be telling you this, because what does it matter anyway? It's just rather bizarre, that's all. Well, you know, I was his nearest neighbour. But when I found your grandfather's deceased body lying on that sofa in the living room, he was surrounded by alpine flowers that had been arranged around his body, some placed in his ears and on his beard. Those flowers were remarkably fresh. They weren't dead. They'd only recently been picked, possibly 20 minutes before I actually arrived at your grandfather's house. Then another curious thing, there was an arrangement of hot stones on his chest that appeared to be displayed in a symbolic design, as if it meant something, you know, like ancient hieroglyphics or something like that. Well, I removed the flowers and the stones before the coroner's van arrived to pick up his corpse, as I was quite sure they would find your grandfather's decorated body most odd, and I certainly didn't want them to give me funny looks, to think that I was some kind of oddball that went around decorating deceased bodies for the hell of it. Suffice to say, it was the strangest thing I've ever seen. It would seem someone else was sad about your grandfather's demise, but the very strange question is who? And why did they douse him like this with all those flowers and stones, for goodness sake? It is peculiar, I agreed. Well, maybe a friend popped around, discovered he was dead, and went out in the field to gather flowers. Maybe they did not want to notify the authorities. Perhaps they were scared that if they found a dead body, that someone might suspect them of foul play. Gus considered my words. Yes, but he was so peaceful when he died. I mean, he was in his 90s. He was expected to go at some point, surely, even if his mind was razor sharp. I'm just trying to think outside the box, that's all, I said. Well, you make a very good point, young lady. Now I will go and get into my truck and overtake you, and you can follow me, and I will point you in the right direction of your grandfather's farm. I'm in a farmhouse only a few miles away. If you need help of any kind, you will find my name in the phone book, next to the landline in the entrance hall. Call me if you need anything. Me and the wife will be glad to be of help. We look out for each other around here. You are welcome to pop around any time you wish to see us for dinner or lunch. My wife Maggie always enjoys a good old natter. Any excuse to have a good old gossip, my Maggie is game every time. I married a woman with the fittest tongue around these parts. If she exercised her body like her tongue, that woman would have a rack to rival any man, he teased. So if you're looking for companionship and a wee bit of company, and you get a little lonely, you know where to come. he said, giving me a friendly wink. "Thanks, I really appreciate it," I said. "You've been most kind." "Not at all," said Gus. "I'm just being neighbourly. Follow me, and I will lead you to your grandfather's place." Gus led the way in his robust truck that made my alpha spider look like the pretty girl on the mountain trail that is wobbling around precariously and is about to faint from the extreme adversity of the challenge, whereas Gus's truck looked like that strapping, intrepid adventurer that could conquer anything that life threw at it. After about 20 minutes, Farmer Gus stopped his truck, and with his arms hanging out of the window, he pointed to an obscure, fatigued, weathered sign that I'm sure once said Willow Creek Farm, now said Low Creek Arm. I made a mental note to get that sign fixed. The farmer drove away, giving me a friendly blow of his horn. Now that Gus was gone, I felt so horribly alone. But thankfully I knew where I was going, so things were finally looking up for me, and my defeated pessimism was being crowned with a more positive, sunny outlook, like a grey sky that has suddenly turned quite sunny. Even my alpha spider seemed to sigh with relief, as its long-suffering tires hit a smoother road that was heavily fringed by vast congregations of trees that interlocked their boughs in a pretty arched canopy above my head, which gracefully shaded the whole driveway and was heavily sprinkled with the pretty confetti of red and gold leaves that had recently fallen, as autumn had grabbed the landscape so vibrantly, like an ardent designer, dressing up the trees in garlands of resplendent golds, russets and reds. I drove through the long tunnel of trees, where small slivers of golden sunlight sliced through their boughs, washing their leafy foliage in a golden glaze. The tree-lined archway finally opened out into a large area of rugged wild grassland, filled with knee-high grasses and pretty pink, yellow and violet alpine flowers. The occasional rocks jutted through the ground in an unusual heaped gathering of voluptuous shapes that were very easy on the eye. It was terribly prepossessing. And then finally nestled there on the edge of an undulating hilly valley, serenaded by sprawling woodgroves of trees on every side, was an old wooden farmhouse, and several rather weathered outbuildings that included a red barn, a stable block, and an extensive open carport that boasted an old tractor, a collection of bicycles, an ATV, and a plethora of rather dusty farming machinery that looked like it belonged to the Stone Ages, that were ancient relics but still in good condition. Then there was a very large empty container with the digits 312 on the side, which I realized I would be using to fill with my grandfather's trash. The biggest surprise for me was that the farmhouse was not dilapidated, nor was it in a bad state of repair, as I had been led to believe by my father, who had painted in my mind a very bleak picture of what I was to encounter when I arrived on the property. On the contrary, the idyllic farmhouse possessed an old-world charm about it, with large sash windows that were in excellent condition, and a gleaming bright red front door that looked as if it had been just polished, along with an extensive wraparound porch kitted out with Adirondack chairs and tables. Suffice to say, under the soft, subdued lighting of early evening, the whole farmhouse looked almost like something out of a twee fairy tale. So this was where my father had grown up as a boy. I tried to imagine him running through the long grass with his sister Louisa, chasing after a kite in the sky, and tears glistened in my eyes as I reflected over my father's young life, of which he harboured many wistfully nostalgic memories, for he had spoken often in great fondness about his childhood, which by all accounts had been a very happy one. But let's just say, living out here, among such idyllic beauty, it's hard to imagine anyone could possibly have a hangdog face. It would be easy to be happy in a place like this, I thought. I knew that this farmhouse held within its foundations the indelible treasured memories of happy summers and winters, when the family had gathered together to enjoy special occasions and the rhythmic routines of daily life under the unassuming grey slate roof. There had been laughter ringing through the farmhouse, as well as tears that were shed, a kaleidoscope of happy ebullient memories that had now been shed like the autumn leaves at the end of a season. It would seem the chapter of my father's life would be well and truly closed once this quaint little farmhouse was sold and came under new ownership, which made me feel quite sad. It must have been a spectacular childhood growing up in such a beguiling part of the world, where instead of honking taxicabs, you heard the wind whistling through the trees, and instead of the trills of people in a coffee shop, you heard the joyful chorus of the birdsong. No wonder my father claimed to have had the best childhood ever. I could see why. I almost envied him for growing up around such serenity and peace. I parked my car in the open carport, next to an old Land Rover that I suspected must have belonged to my grandfather. It was dusty and caked in mud, but it didn't look to be in bad condition at all, and was certainly far more practical for this landscape than my ridiculously utopian Alpha Spider. I decided then and there that if I took any trips into the local town, I would definitely be using my grandfather's truck and not my Alpha Spider. As my eyes ran over the prepossessing scenery, I began to relax, feeling certain that my father had exaggerated about the mess that I would need to clean up. As I surveyed the outer perimeters of the property, everything seemed to be in apple pie order, almost fastidiously neat, given that Sloppy Joe had a reputation of being a slob. I climbed out of my Alpha Spider, my legs stiff from my journey. I trudged over to the very shallow trunk and pulled out my small suitcase on wheels, along with a brown bag of food shopping, which I clutched tightly to my chest. I trotted over towards the front door, wheeling my suitcase behind me. I glanced towards the very old oak tree to the side of the house that my father told me he loved to climb as a boy. The tree was one of the most magnificent oak trees I have ever beheld. I marvelled at its grandiose size and the great girth of its powerful trunk. The tree was easily 500 years old. Well, I'd been told that anyway, and my father's entire family had engraved their names in that trunk. All of a sudden I was sure I'd seen something in my peripheral vision, a shadowy movement from behind this very mature, stately-looking tree. The hairs in the back of my neck began to prickle. Something was out there, and whatever it was watching me. I could feel its eyes burrowing into the back of my neck. Don't be silly, I told myself, secretly cursing the Stephen King book I was reading. What induced me to read a book like that, when I'd be spending a whole week alone in my grandfather's farmhouse, when the suggestions in a Stephen King book would lightly toy with my mind like a cat teasing a mouse? I didn't mind being scared out of my skull when I was in a cushy environment where I felt safe and secure, like my apartment in Boston. Indeed, in such a secure environment, I enjoyed the scare that books invoked in me. But out here, I didn't need an author's suggestion to feed the meat of my imagination, like a hungry pool of piranhas. Of course, there was nothing there, I told myself. Get a grip, Sky. But then I was sure I saw it again. A flicker of movement from behind the tree. I was certain I'd seen the flash of a face and a humongous body. But when I glanced towards the trees, nothing was there. "Stephen King!" I growled under my breath. "This is all your fault! I would not be seeing things that aren't there if it wasn't for you. Normally I like you, Stephen King, but right now, I don't mean to be rude, but you are not my friend. You're putting warped ideas into my head. Ideas that I do not want to entertain." I fumbled around awkwardly under the various plant pots in search for the front door key of my grandfather's property, and I found it under a terracotta pot that contained a huge bush of pink hanging geraniums that were in surprisingly good nick for plants that had not enjoyed a good watering in a while. As I opened the front door, I felt that prickling feeling again, as if eyes were drilling into the back of my neck. Something was definitely out there. I was sure of it. I turned around to study the tall oak tree more closely, but nothing was there. Was I going completely stark raving mad? Of course I was. But it was difficult to see anything, as the tangerine-coloured sunset had melted away like butter, and the light of the day had now been confiscated, so that the firmament was now plunged into a murky grey colour. Before long, it would be dark. I shook my head and plunged the key into the lock, and pushed the door open. It swung smoothly on its hinges, as if it had been recently oiled. I walked cautiously inside the house, dragging my suitcase behind me, and once I was in the entrance hall, I double-bolted the lock behind me. The elegantly presented entrance hall was tiled in dark red terracotta tiles, and boasted a grandiose Turkish rug with designs in rich scarlets, blues and reds. In pride of place, against the wall was a very ornate, beautifully carved walnut desk that possessed lots of tiny little drawers. It was now covered in piles of post, and on the adjacent wall was a long rail of hooks where overcoats had been hung, and on the floor below, on a vertical shoe stand, was a long line of walking boots, all lined up in a neat row. On first impressions, the farmhouse looked as neat as a new pin, and not like a place where a slob would reside. But appearances can be very deceptive, as I was soon to discover. The entrance hall and the first living room were impressively tidy, giving you the false impression that the rest of the rooms in the house were equally as well turned out and presented. I realized my grandfather had kept the outside of his property and the first 2 rooms in his farmhouse very attractive and neatly ordered, so that no one would guess about the chaos within the rest of the house. I could understand him doing that. I knew when guests came to my apartment in Boston, if there was any mess in the place, I would hurriedly hide it away in cupboards, so that on the outside everything looked tidy, as only my closets hid the secret chaos behind their benign doors. It was the other rooms in my grandfather's house that gave me the shock of my life. It was as if a whirlwind or a tornado had invaded the house unscrupulously, tipping over books, magazines, newspapers, out onto every available surface, and casting around as much upheaval as possible. I felt as if I was walking through a junkyard, as there were boxes piled high with knickknacks and old beer cans and bottles. It was as if every single part of the kitchen sink was lying on every floor of every room in the house. Plastic bags containing old bills that had been knotted up and lay in a large collection on one side of a room, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. There were thick clouds of dust choking every available surface, wispy cobwebs, mouse droppings and insect carcasses lying in scattered clumps across carpets, wooden floorboards and tiled floors. I got to see room after room was in complete chaos and disarray, apart from my grandfather's surprisingly neat, well-ordered bedroom that had thankfully been unaffected by the pandemonium that afflicted the rest of the house like a deadly, unsightly disease. My grandfather's own bedroom was like the entrance hall and the first living room, which was a huge relief to me. At least I knew where I would sleep tonight. There was a large king-size bed in the bedroom that had been freshly made up with clean cotton sheets that smelt of lavender, 2 nightstands with Tiffany lamps, a large dresser, an upholstered chair, a dressing room and a bathroom, all that were very well presented and perfectly clean, even if the furniture was slightly tatty and outdated, and the curtains rather threadbare. I wondered sadly if my grandfather had kept the bedroom neat, as a mark of respect for my grandmother, as I believe she had been very punctilious when she was alive. I was sad to see, when I opened up my grandfather's closets, that my grandmother's clothes from over 30 years back still remained hanging on the clothes rails, covered in plastic wrapping and tissue paper, and on the walnut dressing table there were her powder puffs, some sterling silver-plated hairbrushes, and crystal perfume bottles with sterling silver tops that were now almost considered antiques, and I believe are very collectible now. I curiously lifted the lid off the perfume bottles to smell the scents. I smelt jasmine in one, rose in the other, and orange blossom neroli in the third. It seemed I had more in common with my late grandmother than I realized, for these were my favourite scents in the entire world. The whole room was now flooded with this fragrant, impressionable bouquet, the wistfully nostalgic scents that brought tears to my eyes. I could almost imagine my grandmother standing there, with her short, curly, blue-rinsed grey hair, staring at me through her pale blue eyes, framed by the flamboyant pink spectacle frame she would always wear, giving me one of her irresistible warm smiles that would always make my heart melt. As strange as it may sound, in that moment I could swear she was standing right there with me, but I told myself I was clearly losing it. First I thought someone was staring at me from outside the property. Now I was imagining my grandmother's ghost was staring at me. How crazy was that? It seemed sad that my grandfather had not been able to let go of his wife, even years after she had gone. I noticed there was a large picture of the happy couple arm in arm, smiling happily into the lens of the camera, when they were probably in their early 20s, along with another picture of my grandparents with 2 kids smiling into the lens. The grinning girl in the picture, with the untidy mop of untamed blonde locks, was Louisa, my father's younger sister, who also was living in Australia. My dad was standing next to her, with a mischievous, rather wicked-looking grin on his face. Some things never changed. I had been told by my father that the kitchen had been a bomb site when the solicitors had entered the property, but thankfully they had seen fit to send in a cleaning team to clean it up and dispose of any old food. And based on what my father had told me about my grandfather using every available bowl in the kitchen to make just one cake, I can only imagine what the cleaners had encountered when they cleaned up the mess after him. Thankfully, I was greeted to a fresh, neat-smelling kitchen, where everything gleamed like a brand-new pin and smelt strongly of lemons. I don't know how I would have coped if I'd met with the old rotting food dripping out of the fridge and seared on the edges of the range cooker, or worse still, rats running at random over the place. So I was thankful for small mercies. I noticed a large box on the kitchen countertop, filled with bleaches and all kinds of cleaning materials purchased by the solicitors to help with my cleaning. It was important for a family member to sort through my grandfather's stuff, in case we encountered anything of value, which was why the whole farmhouse had not been cleaned by professionals. I did notice black burn marks on the ceiling of the kitchen that suggested that the ceiling at one point had been exposed to a fire of some kind. I was surprised but very pleased to see there was fresh milk in the refrigerator, bacon, eggs, ham, sliced turkey, cream, cheese, pasta, salad, and fresh bread. How kind, I thought, feeling touched by the generosity of strangers. The solicitors knew I was coming, and they had catered for my every need, probably on the instructions of my father, which meant I would not go hungry, nor would I need to waste time or energy going to town for supplies, which was a monumental help for me. Even though the temperature had dipped considerably, as it was early autumn, and I became a wee bit chilly, I just threw on a sweater over my pyjamas and made myself a sizable plate of bacon and eggs for dinner, and then, feeling exhausted and satisfied, I trundled off to my bed. And when you're extremely fatigued like I was, it doesn't matter where you fall asleep. You will surrender to its demands very quickly. I was soon out like a light, my head hitting the pillow like a wave crashing against the rock. I awoke in the middle of the night to feel a warm pressure on my legs, and I looked down to find a black cat lying by my feet. He rolled happily on his back and began to purr considerably. I realized to my amazement that maybe everyone had forgotten about my grandfather's beloved cat Boris. But he was very much alive and well, it would seem. He'd probably had to survive on mice and little birds after Joe had died. Poor thing. I felt such empathy for the little mite, who seemed surprisingly well upholstered for a cat, whom has independently had to rely on itself to survive. Cats are remarkably self-sufficient creatures in that regard. I would have to take him back home with me and adopt him as my own, once I got back to Boston, and once I'd completed the job here. But I would be glad to have a companion in the meantime, to complete this thankless job, even if it was being done in such a pretty setting. I closed my eyes and fell back to sleep, happy not to be completely on my own. I woke up the following morning with the light streaming through my grandfather's bedroom. The sketchy, highly deficient curtains were so flimsy that it was not much of a challenge for the morning light to trespass audaciously through such fine, less than adequate fabric that was so sheer it would make a pair of silk stockings look thick. For a moment I felt disorientated and confused, as I tried to make sense of my bearings, but the lingering scent of my grandmother's rose perfume brought me back to reality furiously fast. Of course, I was staying at my grandfather's farmhouse. I glanced down at my chest and smiled to myself. Boris was cradled in my arms, his long paws outstretched. He was behaving like he'd known me all his life, and the moment my eyes lingered over his body, he began to purr, his green eyes studying me curiously. I lay there for a while in my grandfather's bed, stroking Boris and collecting my thoughts together. I dreaded working my way through all my grandfather's stuff, but the job needed to be done, and first things first. I climbed out of bed, throwing on my jeans and sweater, and briefly ran a brush through my hair. Then I brushed my teeth, while Boris tagged behind me like a devoted dog. as if he was terribly afraid to let me out of his sight, lest I should abandon him like my grandfather had done, by serendipitously dying. I was surprised to find that the store cupboard was very well kitted out, and there was a huge supply of canned tuna and a plethora of canned cat food that had probably been purchased by my grandfather, but it was all well within its sell-by dates, so I opened up a canned tin of tuna for the cat and put it on a plate. Little Boris guzzled that tuna like a prisoner in Auschwitz, being given chocolate for the very first time and going ballistic. The poor thing had clearly missed his tuna. He began to purr, rubbing his head against me tenderly, as if marking me as his new best friend. After enjoying a large mug of coffee and some toast and jam, I began to peritonaciously gather bin bags together, which I proceeded to stuff with all my grandfather's trinkets that no longer had any earthly use. I made 3 piles, 1 for stuff to be thrown out, 2 for stuff to be donated to relevant charities, and 3 for stuff to be kept. But the way things were steadfastly progressing, it would seem most of the stuff was heading directly to the dump. Soon I got into the methodical rhythm of things. The cleaning up became relatively plain sailing. Most of the stuff obviously needed disposing of, from cardboard boxes, papers, comics, old letters, magazines, beer cans, and so it was easy enough. But this throwing out malarkey, as my father had wisely warned me, was certainly not for the faint-hearted. He was right about that. Before long I had piled a great deal of the trash into the outside dumpster, and as one room was emptied out, I felt a huge sense of self-congratulatory accomplishment and pride. I soon ran a hoover over the room, dusting and polishing fastidiously, until it gleamed and shone, leaving the room smelling like lavender polish, and looking like something in a magazine. That's if you didn't pay too much attention to some of the outdated, rather frayed furnishings. In a strange way, it was actually quite a satisfying feeling cleaning away stuff, rather like removing the dust from an old diamond and buffing it up again. As I glanced around the room that I had thoroughly cleared out, I could not help reflecting how pitiful it was that my grandfather had allowed this unnecessary clutter to completely dominate his household, robbing him of fully enjoying the prepossessing benefits of this perfectly lovely room. And with a touch of fresh paint, it would be very homely indeed. In fact, once I finished clearing out all the clutter in this farmhouse would be every buyer's dream, who was looking for a dreamy location in the countryside, that is. It was when I returned to the kitchen that I noticed there was a large golden urn on the windowsill that I realized contained my grandfather's ashes. I knew I would need to be sprinkling them in the woodgrove when I got the chance. It was so sad to see that his remains fitted into this tiny little container. I decided I'd done enough clearing out for the day. It seemed almost criminal to be confined indoors, when the breathtaking countryside beckoned to me, and the soft light of the afternoon sun enveloped me so warmly in a friendly hug. I decided that this would be the quintessential opportunity to go for a much-needed walk to stretch my legs out of doors. But as I was casually ambling through the entrance hall of my grandfather's house, I found myself inexplicably and rather strangely drawn to the very attractive walnut desk. The telephone was on one side of the desk, next to a phone book with the names and telephone numbers of my grandfather's friends, along with a great big pile of untouched post. But that is not what grabbed my attention. I noticed a tiny piece of black thin ribbon dangling out of one of the tiny drawers in the desk, so I pulled the drawer open, but it was completely empty of any contents. Only the thin black ribbon dangled from beyond the empty drawer, as if it was snagged up in something that was possibly caught up in the back. I tugged at the black ribbon, and then suddenly the back of the drawer slided back like a drawbridge and opened out into a secret hiding place, and I realized the black ribbon was attached to a thin little leather notebook. I was to discover to my amazement that this was my grandfather's secret journal. You're kidding me, I thought. I held the leather book in my hands. It was smooth to the touch. Would it hurt to have a quick peek at what my grandfather had written inside? I mean, what harm could it do? My grandfather was dead. It might be interesting to read his thoughts in the small leather book, I thought. So I abandoned all thoughts of the walk and retreated to the bedroom, lying back on the large bed, with my grandfather's devoted cat at my side, who continually purred. There were a few entries in my grandfather's diary that rarely got my attention.
May the 1st, 1996. Ever since my beloved wife passed away, I am left with the unsettling feeling that I am not alone, and that something or someone is watching me. Either that, or I'm completely losing my mind, and I would like to think that the former is the case. I mean, let's not kid. I'm not getting any younger, but I'm sure these feelings are not the imaginings of a lonely man. Granted, I do feel very alone, without my beloved wife by my side, but I'm not making this up. Something is out there. The feeling of being watched persists day after day. Another peculiarity that I'm trying to make sense of is that I've been preparing my firewood for the long winter ahead, months in advance, which is what I always do in preparation for the winter. So I began to dutifully chop up the wood. Once again, that rarely discomposing feeling that I was being watched seemed to grab me by the scruff of my collar, sending chills down my spine. But when I observed my immediate surroundings, nothing was there. The following morning, when I went back to the piles of wood that I was supposed to be chopping, it had all been chopped up for me, and furthermore neatly piled together in a meticulous row in the barn. I have never been this tidy myself. It looked as if my barn had been neatly swept for me. I cannot for the life of me comprehend who would chop my firewood like this. I thought it must be Gus, my nearest neighbour, discreetly lending me a helping hand with my wood chopping. But he assured me he battles with chopping even his own firewood, due to the arthritis in his wrists, his hands and his fingers, so he wouldn't be inclined to chop mine for me, unless I was in very disagreeable health. He looked at me kind of funny, I have to say, as if he secretly wondered whether I was losing my mind or getting early-stage dementia. But I know I did not chop that firewood, nor did I tidy up my barn. I could never have done such a good job. I am quite befuddled by all of this. May the 25th, 1996. I had seen wild turkeys hanging around my property, disappearing discreetly into the wood grove, and I had in mind that I wanted to shoot one of those sizable birds, one that was so massive he was practically begging to be roasted, with crisp potatoes and parsnips, along with a plethora of delicious sage and onion stuffing. My late wife would have loved a turkey like this to cook, especially for Thanksgiving and Christmas, but I'd rather not go there, as thinking of my late wife will bring on the melancholia that I find quite hard to shake off. I have tasted those wild turkeys before, and man, do they taste sumptuously good. So much better than the ghastly stuff you buy in the frozen aisle of the supermarket, that does not taste like the real thing. Possibly because it's been injected with all those E-numbers. The things those food production companies get up to is scandalous. When I saw the turkeys drifting in the woodgrove, I was like a kid in a sweet shop, and I knew I had to have one of those turkeys. I reasoned with myself that I could get Gus's wife Maggie to turn that sizable turkey into the most delectable pies, roasts and burgers. And believe me, that woman can cook like my old mother used to, and is not intimidated to pluck out a few feathers either. I appreciate women like that, who aren't afraid of getting their hands dirty. That's a real woman for me. I surreptitiously went after those turkeys, carrying my hunting rifle in my hands. I am no hunter, and I don't pretend to be otherwise. I mean, I haven't got the patience to hide out for hours on end, waiting for the ideal moment to take down a turkey or a deer. I have seen far too often how many fatigued hunters return from their hunts empty-handed and bitterly disappointed after the deer they've been stalking has masterfully eluded them. Of course I admire their perseverance and their skillful determination not to give up. But I'm not that long-suffering, nor that tenacious, I'm afraid. The wild turkeys did not see me at first, but once again, when I entered the woodgrove, I had the profound sense that something was watching me. You have no idea how annoying it is to feel eyes on you, but you can't find their source. I managed to hide behind a tree and was not observed by those turkeys, so I was clandestinely rather impressed with myself, with my discretion. But I did a short stint in the army, and had to learn to surreptitiously creep up on a foe with a certain amount of success. Unfortunately, things went badly pear-shaped for me from thenceforth, as I regret I aimed my rifle at one of those turkeys, and it seemed that my bullet misfired dreadfully, and there were feathers flapping around along with the screeching sounds of the turkeys as they bulleted away and were completely gone from my sight. I was crestfallen, reasonably downhearted, I have to say, by my abysmal hunting skills and complete lack of progress. I was getting ready to leave the woodgrove, and it was only then that I realized that the largest turkey that I had been aiming at with my rifle was lying deceased on the forest floor. I was sure I had missed it, but it was as dead as a dodo. Maybe I wasn't such a bad hunter after all. I must have killed it. I felt so delighted as I picked up the turkey in my hands and went back to the farmhouse with it. But that was when I noticed that the neck of the turkey had been strangled. It had not been killed by a gunshot. I don't know how to describe how shocked I was. That turkey was alive and well in front of my eyes. I tried to kill it with my hunting rifle. I thought I'd missed it as it ran away. Well, I thought it did. But there it was, mysteriously lying on the floor of the woodgrove, strangled. If I didn't kill it, then who did? Something strange is happening. Anyway, I told Maggie I'd killed the turkey, and she's eager to cook it for us. The only sobering thought is, if I didn't kill the turkey, then who did? June the 12th, 2002. Last night I could have been killed. It's a miracle that I am not dead. I just can't believe that I'm still alive and well, breathing in God's rich fresh air. But something saved my life last night. And the roof over my head, I hasten to say. I think with the onset of old age, I'm getting a tad forgetful. Sometimes I cringe when I think of my late wife. She could be looking down on me from the heavens and seeing the pig's ear I've made of this house. I actually feel my whole face and ears flushing bright red when I think about it. I'm only glad that my son and daughter don't visit me here at the farmhouse. They would be so bitterly disappointed in all the chaos. And if they would see it, I would feel very ashamed. My late wife, bless her heart, was prudently punctilious when she was alive, so very good at keeping things well ordered and clean. But me managing the internal affairs of this property, beyond the general maintenance, is tough going. I'm happy, of course, to fix a leaking faucet, regrout some tiles that need fixing, fix up windows, but cleaning and organizing is not my forte. My kids' bedrooms are now compunctiously buried beneath newspapers and comics, like the bricks and scaffolding you see after an earthquake. It really is that bad, and I'm man enough to admit that tackling this mountain of stuff is something I cannot contemplate. I keep telling myself I will attend to it one day, but the way things are looking, one day is a long time in the future. I try my best keeping my bedroom, the entrance hall and lounge as clean as possible, and I manage to do a relatively good job, with a small peppering of pride, I hasten to say. But the rest of the house, well, I've used it as a dumping ground. I throw things in those rooms, closing the doors behind me, so I can pretend that the mess doesn't exist. But I know it's really there. I should tidy it up, of course, but it is too much like hard work, and I can be a wee bit lazy. That's what me and my beloved black cat have in common. That cat likes the same things as me. a leisurely life, and food that easily comes out of a can. I've never been much of a cook, so I'm grateful for Maggie always popping around with her delicious casseroles and her endless supplies of key lime pie and homemade scones. Honestly, that woman is a gem. She's a real-life domestic goddess if I ever saw one. Last night I decided to make some potato chips. Maggie makes the most incredible potato chips. I told her she makes better chips than the diner in town, and I meant every word of that. I have never given out compliments freely. I'm not that nice, I'm afraid. Suffice to say, Maggie modestly waved her hands in the air and told me the chips were easy to make and she'd give me some lessons. And on Tuesday night, she gave me a lesson. It seemed pretty straightforward to me. I felt reasonably confident that yes, I could do this. I peeled and boiled the chips and left them between sheets of kitchen towel to dry, while I placed the chip pan on the hob. I decided to just read the newspaper in the living room for a while, and I forgot all about the oil boiling away on the hob. Can you believe that? Maggie warned me about that.
Don't you dare leave the oil unattended. You mustn't leave the kitchen while the oil is on the hob. Do you understand that?
But I did not listen, and my smoke alarm had run out of batteries. It was on the blink, so it didn't ring. I must have drifted off for a few minutes. I suddenly woke up when a huge stone came flying through the living room window, shattering the glass, followed by two more that landed at my feet in perfect unison, while glass lay precariously all over the walnut floors. I was so stunned that through bleary, rather confused eyes, caught up under the throes of my lethargy, I suddenly smelt the acrid smell of the burning fat. Oh my God, the chips! I ran into the kitchen, and 4-foot flames, or long tongues of fire, were dancing up to the ceiling, as the chip pan was ablaze. It was a terrifying sight, as I knew those flames, if they got any worse, my farmhouse would surely go down in flames. I grabbed the fire extinguisher in the kitchen, and I managed to quickly douse out the angry flames. I knew in that moment that something out there, the thing that has been watching me all this time, has been responsible for throwing those stones through my living room window to alert me to the problem. If that thing had not woken me up, God only knows I wouldn't be here now. That I know to be true. Ostensibly, I ended up cooking those chips in the oven. And I will never, and I repeat never again, cook with a pan of oil on the stove. Nor will I invest in a deep fat fryer. I'm sure those things can be dangerous too. If Maggie had any comprehension that I'd left a chip pan on the hob, unattended to, she would be furious with me. She warned me of the dangers. There are some things I shall not be sharing with her very willingly. I feel as if I came a hair's breadth from being burnt alive in my own home, and that would not have been a good way to go. May the 3rd, 2003. They were predicting rain today, but I thought the weather forecast was horribly wrong. Let's just say the weather started out rather lovely, but it suddenly changed dramatically, from sunny to grey and overcast. Awful pity, really. I love this time of year, I really do. When the bleached grass becomes green and the trees begin to burst with brand new life, boasting blossoms and green leafy foliage. I am not a domesticated person by any manner of means, but I decided to industriously wash the kitchen curtains, hanging them up on the line, given that they'd gathered a great deal of dust over the years, and the feeling of springtime in the air had given me a fleeting energy boost that does not happen very often to me. So I should fully maximize on its benefits. The wife would be proud of me. Of that I was most certain. By the time I'd taken the curtains down from the railings, washed them and hung them up on the line to dry, I was exhausted. I don't mind admitting that. I was certainly in need of a pick-me-up, A nice cold glass of ale would do the trick nicely, I thought. Soon I read the paper, drank down my ale, and fell fast asleep, awakened to the pleasant sound of rain pelting down on the roof. Then I remembered the washing on the line, and hurriedly dashed outside to retrieve the curtains. But they were gone. What had happened to them? I was completely befuddled, I hasten to say. Who had taken down my washing, and where was it? I decided to worry about the matter in the morning. And when I was greeted to a brand new day, to my amazement, I observed my washing had returned to the line, and was happily drying there under the morning sun. What the hell, I thought. This is crazy. Someone rescued my washing, and then hung it out again to dry, when the sun came out. Goodness gracious me. Someone was certainly watching over me. But who? That was the question. June the 5th, 2004. I have no way of fully understanding or comprehending what actually happened to me today. But finally I have answers. All this time, when I knew something was clandestinely watching me from the shadows, it seems I was not wrong. I now know who killed a turkey for me, who chopped firewood for me, cleaned the barn out, rescued my washing from the line, saved me from burning to death in my own home. At long last, I have found the enigmatic answers to my questions. Of course, it stands to perfect reason that I shall not be telling anyone my secret. For a start, I doubt anyone would believe my story, and frankly, in their shoes, I wouldn't blame them either. So some secrets are best contained here in my journal, just like this one is. It had started, by all accounts, as a normal day. I went to town to restock up on supplies. I needed to buy plenty of tins for me and my beloved cat. I filled up my truck with gas, met a couple of locals in town for a bit of dinner. I had not seen Rose and Eli Riesling for a long time, you see. They're very good people, but I loathe the pity I sometimes see in their eyes. I think they think I'm a lonely man. They feel sorry for me. There's nothing more pitiful than people feeling sorry for you. It's actually quite condescending, really. While I do admit to getting lonely, despite what they might think, I have a very full, meaningful life. I enjoy reading and ambling around the countryside in my ATV, or even walking on foot. I also enjoy growing my own vegetables and tending to the maintenance jobs on the farm. But they don't understand any of that. I think they believe I'm miserable all the time, and that is not true at all. Of course I miss my beloved wife, but I've managed to make a good life for myself, and have a great deal of friends, especially with Gus and Maggie around. And let's not kid. I'm keeping my brain very sharp with my regular chess games with Gus. It must be so hard for you, Rose kept saying to me, being out there on your own in that farmhouse, with no one to look out for you. I can't imagine. Don't you worry that out there on your own, if something fortuitous were to happen, something quite dreadful, how would you ever manage to get any help? I've got Gus and Maggie, I said curtly. They're my nearest neighbours. We keep tabs on each other. Yes, but even so, don't you see, said Rose gingerly. Neighbours don't live in each other's pockets, do they? What I'm saying is that without someone else being on the farm with you, if you were to fall off a ladder perhaps, how would you get help? Those kind of things do happen. I mean, do you know so many accidents happen in the home all over America every single year? It's horrifying, and some are life-threatening, you know. Why, only 6 months ago, I fell off the ladder when I was getting Christmas decorations out of the attic. I broke my ankle really badly. I was in dreadful pain. I couldn't get up, but thankfully Eli was there for me to squirrel me away to hospital, where I underwent a very swift operation. But what would you do in a similar predicament? I dread to think." I do not deny that Rose's ominous words did hit me hard. I knew she was right. Being alone out here on the farm does make me distinctly more vulnerable than most, even though Gus and Maggie check on me regularly. If anything untoward were to happen to me, time could be of the essence, I must admit, and it did leave me feeling unsettled. But you know what? I can't dwell on such bleak considerations that are beyond my control. But it's people like Rose who always make me dwell on worst-case scenarios. She does tend to be rather negative about things.
"You know what you should do," said Rose. "Get a tenant, someone to live on the farm with you, so you're never alone, never on your own. That is exactly what I would do if I was wearing your shoes. I couldn't bear to live in a great big farmhouse all on my own, all alone, especially at my age. And you're the same age as I am."
Rose's words in theory seemed like a good idea, but in practice it would mean I'd have to clean out all the spare rooms on my farm, throw out all the mess, and that is a non-starter for me. It's too much like hard work. I don't mind admitting when I returned from town, I felt ever so slightly downhearted, much as I like Eli and Rose. I'm afraid Rose is one of those insufferable people that sucks the energy out of you. I felt considerably drained after our rendezvous. I was almost feeling sorry for Eli, being married to such a pessimistic woman, who's always parroting on and on about things one does not want to think about, or would wish not to trespass across one's imagination. She was discussing a man who had a tapeworm in his body that was practically starving him to death, as the worm inside him was eating up all his food. This she discussed at great length while we were in the middle of eating our hamburgers. Then she went on to share in detail the tragic story of a friend she knew, who was killed in a hunting accident. And she went into explicit detail about how his intestines came seeping out of his body after the bullet exploded in his guts.
"You were there at the time of the hunting accident, weren't you, Eli? He saw the whole thing, Joe. Please tell Joe, Eli, all about how the intestines looked like the big fat spicy sausages you get at the butcher's. I promise you, Joe, it was too terrible for words. Poor Eli here was having nightmares night after night, ever since the event. Weren't you, Eli?"
Eli grimaced. "Rose, I would prefer it if we didn't talk about this while we were eating our hamburgers," he said obsequiously. "It's not a memory I want to recall."
"I know, dear. It's not easy reflecting over what happened to your friend. But the trauma counsellor told you it's good to talk about these things, didn't she?"
Eli smirked. "To talk about my feelings, Rose, but not to keep harping on about the grisly details of the event over and over again. You keep bringing up my friend's intestines spread over the forest floor again and again, Rose, as if you're talking nonchalantly about buying sausages at the butcher's. I'll never feel the same about those spicy sausages again, not only because of what I saw in the woods, but because you keep harping on about the matter over and over again, never letting it drop for a moment." I couldn't help but agree with Eli on this. That infuriating wife of his goes into macabre detail over everything, which is hard going when you're trying to enjoy a burger. Suffice to say, when I got back to the farmhouse, I think I just felt a little down in the dumps. And I know what alleviates my depression faster than anything else in the world, and that's an ATV ride in the woodgrove. I find being among the trees is so reassuring. It brings me such peace of mind, and it was peace I was craving right now. I climbed onto my ATV and whizzed down the earthen trails of the woodgrove, scaring off some turkeys and a couple of startled deer in the process. But it was beguilingly beautiful in the woods, and I found the heaviness in my heart immediately dissipated. "Damn Rose," I muttered under my breath. "I'll be damned if she tries to ruin my peaceful life in this farmhouse. by filling my heart with mortifying scenarios of dreadful things that might become of me, being stuck out here on my own. I think it was the images that Rose had planted inauspiciously in my head, like seeds that suddenly take root and mercilessly tease your imagination. I hasten to say an anger was brewing inside me, almost like a fire starter being thrown at some dry kindling, which begins to light up into an uncontrollable blaze, and is very tricky to put out. That was how my indignation appeared to be growing inside me. Without realizing it, I put my foot down on the accelerator rather too hard, and was zooming through the woodgrove at a ridiculously high speed. But I did not care. I was blowing all caution to the wind, and God only knows why. I think that kind of frustration can sometimes fuel an unsuppressed energy within you that can get a wee bit out of control. That was when I saw it. For some reason, a tree trunk had fallen across the earthen path, and I had not seen it in time to break my ATV. The next thing I knew was I went flying out of my ATV. When it hit the tree trunk, I remember being flung over some ferns, which thankfully cushioned my fall. But my ATV had tumbled over on its side. I began to wince with pain as it shot mercilessly through my ankles, causing even the backs of my legs to throb violently. I tried to get back onto my feet. The pain was insufferable. It seemed like an impossible feat to overcome. I have never cried much in my life, but I don't mind admitting that tears glistened in my eyes as I wondered how the hell on God's earth I was going to hobble all the way from the woodgrove to the house on an ankle that was buckling beneath me. I was groaning and twisting in agony as the pain continued to shoot through my body, like fireworks on the 4th of July. All of a sudden, I got the profound sense that something was watching me. It caused prickles to creep up the back of my neck, and for my heart to beat violently against my chest wall, because something was there, and I felt incredibly vulnerable. And then I saw her. She was desperately shy, aloof, rather evasive even, but her desire to help me overcame her obvious reticence. When I saw her, I knew at once what she was. There was no doubt in my mind. But in truth, I thought her kind came out of fairy tales and modern-day hoaxes that people play on their friends. But not for the life of me did I remotely believe that a fictitious character in a fairy tale could actually be real. I remember when my mother used to read me fairy tales as a boy. I would ask her if unicorns, goblins, elves, and fairies were real, and she would say, "I believe they may have existed at one time, Joe. I really do. For every fictional story must have been birthed out of some kind of truth. I know, for example, many of the Irish believe in the Fae. Indeed, there are hundreds of incredulous accounts that have been recorded over many years about the Fae. So you mark my words, there is curious stuff that happens outside in our world, beyond our ken." The creature that was standing before me was a Bigfoot. I sucked in my breath, wondering if the pain in my ankle had got so dreadfully bad that I was now beginning to hallucinate, seeing things that were not there. But I promise you this, she was as real as you or me. In truth, she was decidedly different to what I would imagine a Bigfoot to be. She didn't have primate influences like you would expect, apart from her overlong arms and the pyramid shape of her head. But otherwise she was remarkably human in every single regard. Only mighty in power and stature, of course. Her body was impressively built, like a great big hulking army tank. She was lofty, majestic, powerful and dense with muscle tone. The moment I saw her, my heart began to pump violently in my chest, not because I was afraid, but because, quite frankly, she was the most intimidating, daunting creature I have ever encountered. I guess I should have been terrified of her, but the benevolent expression she gave me allayed all my concerns, and instead of feeling fear, A warm kind of reassurance washed over me, and I felt completely at peace in her charge. She looked on me lovingly, in the devoted, adoring way a mother looks upon her child, but I knew she'd have much preferred to remain in the shadows. But she had shown herself to me, to give me the help that I so clearly needed at this point in time. She ambled over to me, squatting down on her haunches and examining my ankle. I was grimacing and wreathing and squealing out in pain as the Bigfoot began to massage the area with her sausage-sized fingers. So the area became incredibly warm, and when I touched it, the skin felt hot, like when you dip your toe into a very warm bath. I watched befuddled as everything began to unfold, almost as if I was caught up in a dream. The Bigfoot scrambled over to my ATV and lifted this ponderous vehicle back onto its feet, and then lifted up the heavy tree trunk, pulling it out of the way. I've never seen such an extraordinary strength exhibited before, in all my life. She reached out with her arm and managed to get me to my feet. I hobbled awkwardly towards my ATV. The Bigfoot looked at me and spoke to me in a strange, rather idiosyncratic language, which incongruously I seemed to understand for some bizarre reason. "Kila kwasa Agrita," she told me. "My name is Agrita." "Kila kwasa okolokoshakasi." It means she watches and protects, and that's what I always do. "Golaki saka, ho golokashi, ho manikale kwasa no ko." You do only get yourself into some tight scrapes, don't you? Luckily you've got me to help bail you out, she said. She spoke with a genuine warm sense of humour. Once I was back on my ATV, the Bigfoot ran by my side when I started up the engine and drove steadily back to the farmhouse. "Kila kwasa, hokulina kasiko no kwa." "Just rest your foot," she told me. "Your ankle's not broken. Kilono kosakan. You'll be better in the morning." And with that she glided away and was gone. When I woke up the following morning, my foot, I hasten to say, was absolutely fine. I certainly did not need a trip to the ER. I couldn't help feeling that the Bigfoot, when she touched my painful area with her warm hands, had performed in some way a natural healing for me. She was certainly a magical creature, that was for sure. I smiled to myself on the irony of things when I thought back of Rose's comments the previous day about me being all on my own. It would seem she was wrong about that. My Bigfoot friend has delivered me from harm on 2 separate occasions, but I'm not about to tell anyone about that. As I lay back on my grandfather's bed, reading these outlandish accounts in his diary, I pondered over what the diary actually revealed. Had my grandfather really encountered a Bigfoot in the woods, a creature who'd watched over him all these years, who'd come to his rescue a couple of times, and killed for him a very sizable turkey, when his shooting skills had left a lot to be desired? Maybe the Bigfoot had felt sorry for him, being such a cack-handed hunter, and had intervened on his behalf, taking down the turkey my grandfather had intended to shoot for himself, with little success. The idea made me laugh. It was a remarkable story, and it might well explain why Gus had informed me that my grandfather's body had been covered by fresh alpine flowers. Could Agrita, the female Bigfoot, have been so sad about my grandfather's passing that she had expressed her condolences by arranging flowers around his deceased corpse? But if that was indeed the case, how did she even know he was dead? Perhaps some mysteries will always remain unanswered. The next days were quite uneventful, as I tossed away a plethora of my grandfather's stuff, although Maggie, Gus's wife, did pop over to see me with a delicious basket of goodies from her farm, which included homemade bread, milk, cheese, cream, honey, eggs, and freshly baked chicken and ham pie, along with date and walnut muffins. "Hello, dear," she said, giving me a huge smile, and climbing out of a rather scratched-up-looking SUV. She trotted over to me with a large basket in her hands. "This is for you. Just some farming produce and a few of my baked goods. My husband Gus told me all about you, and what you're doing here, What a lonely job, cleaning up after your grandfather, Joe. I thought some light refreshments were obviously in order, and I wondered if you fancied a little girly chat. It can get awfully lonely out here, and sometimes the cell phone reception can be hit and miss. But more to the point, how are you doing?
Well, it hasn't been too bad. I'm making good progress, I suppose. Thank you for these lovely gifts. It's so kind of you. Would you like to come in for a coffee?
Do I look the type to look a gift horse in the mouth? She teased. I'm sure Gus has told you all about me. I love a quintessential excuse for a good old natter. And out here on the farm, friends are a valuable treasure indeed, which I have always esteemed gratefully. So I'm not going to say no to that coffee that you're offering, although I would prefer it if it was tea, if you don't mind.
Tea it is, then, I said, ushering Maggie into the farmhouse. She glanced briefly over at the huge drum containing my grandfather's trash that was parked only a few yards away from the front door, where black bin liners were piled up high, one on top of the other, in a huge heap. She raised a brow.
It looks like you've had your work cut out for you, and that you've thrown out quite a lot of stuff, she said sympathetically. Unfortunately, Joe was quite a hoarder. I knew he kept a couple of rooms in his house very nice, for the purpose of entertaining fortuitous visitors. But let's just say the rest of the house was pandemonium. I offered to help him sort it out, you know. But Joe, he could be a very proud man. I think he was embarrassed by the mess. If we visited him, he would squirrel us away to the tidy living room. If you didn't know any better, you'd believe the rest of the house was scrupulously tidy. So it was quite the shocker when we ventured into the other rooms of the house. But by the looks of things, and the lovely smell of lavender polish, you've done a sterling job here.
I liked Maggie at once. She wore her heart on her sleeve, and was easygoing and carefree. She had dark, short hair, and brown, bear-like eyes, and she had a pear-shaped matriarch-like figure, which was very endearing, which made me like her all the more. Soon I was bustling around the kitchen with a kettle singing away merrily on the hob, but I didn't stand on ceremony, and just threw tea bags into 2 mugs, and presented one to Maggie. She enjoyed her tea rather milky, but with no sugar.
I'm sweet enough, she told me. I'm sorry about your grandfather, Joe, she said, her eyes dancing over to the urn that was still sitting on the kitchen window. He was such a lovely man, he really was. We're both, well, me and my husband, of course, are going to miss him dreadfully. And Gus has now lost an invaluable bridge partner to boot. But what can I say? It was his time to go.
You believe that? I asked her.
Oh, absolutely, said Maggie. I think there's a time to be born and a time to die, like the Bible suggests. Your grandfather was one of the lucky ones, of course. He lived to a ripe old age. Some of us aren't that lucky. It was my husband who found him lying fast asleep on the couch, looking so incredibly peaceful. Only he wasn't asleep, of course. He was dead.
I know, he told me about that, I said.
Well, did he tell you about all the alpine flowers that were displayed around your grandfather's body? And the strange stones arranged on his chest? And furthermore, when he arrived at the farmhouse, the front door was left wide open, would you believe? I know your grandfather never locked his doors, which was something that always unsettled us, because I don't care whether you live in the heart of the countryside or not. You always hear in the news that bad things can happen wherever you live in the world. Your grandfather never entertained such bleak thoughts. He was a very upbeat man most of the time. Even so, finding the front door wide open, almost torn off its hinges, was oddly bizarre, I have to say. Well, I'm glad to tell you Gus did fix the door. He's very good with his hands, you know. I mean, I ask you, have you ever heard anything so incredulous in regards to rocks being displayed on your grandfather's body? Gus reminded me that on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, visitors to the graves there put stones on the graves after they visit their deceased relatives. I saw it myself, actually, when I visited the Mount of Olives on a trip to Jerusalem, about 4 years ago, I think it was. So many of the graves there were covered in rocks. I believe they do it to keep the departed where they belong. But arranging stones on a dead man's chest, well, it makes no sense to me at all, she said, shaking her head vehemently. Gus got the impression that the stones had been arranged symbolically. Needless to say, my husband wisely removed the stones off the body. He certainly didn't want the emergency services to think that he had done this outlandish stuff to the corpse. What would they think? He was a complete oddball or something. Maggie lowered her voice, holding my stare with her eyes. But get this, Gus told me the stones to the touch were hot. You know, like those hot stones they use for massage therapies. It was very bizarre.
Maggie released a long-drawn-out sigh that sounded remarkably like a bus exhaust when the bus grinds to a noisy stop.
Well, it suggests that someone out there knew your grandfather had died. The coroner said he died of natural causes. There was nothing sinister about his demise at all. I think the person that found your grandfather put some flowers around him and bogged off into the sunset. They wanted somebody else to find him. They obviously didn't want to call the authorities themselves. People can be very strange, you know. They like to distance themselves from uncomfortable scenarios, don't they?
Do you think you know who might have done all this bizarre stuff to my grandfather's body? I asked Maggie pointedly.
You know what? I've been thinking about that an awful lot as it happens, and I believe it may well be Rose and Eli. Now, they were very good friends of your grandfather's when he was alive, and Rose made no secret of the fact that she was worried about your grandfather Joe's safety when he was stuck at the farmhouse all on his own. Well, they can be an odd pair, the two of them. They used to keep pet guinea pigs, you know, and when one died, Rose organised a funeral for the thing with flowers and a complete ceremony. She's quite quirky, she really is. I think she might have arranged those stones on your grandfather's body. But for God's sake, don't tell anyone I told you this. But Rose, well, she's a bit eccentric. She's got a macabre fixation over death, you could say. Goodness gracious me, the last time I saw her in town, she was going on and on in great detail about a man's intestines falling out of his bowels during a hunting accident. That woman's got no scruples. She talks about the kind of things that gross most people out. But she seems to love doing it. I don't know why.
It was good having Maggie over for tea, and her date and walnut muffins just melted in the mouth. But that woman could talk. Finally, when she was about to leave, her eyes glanced briefly towards the urn of ashes lying on the kitchen windowsill.
Tell me to mind my own business, she asked me. But if you're planning to scatter your grandfather's ashes, I would highly recommend scattering them in the woodgrove. Your grandfather adored the woods on the property.
As it happens, that's what I'm actually planning to do.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it, she said.
5 days later, I was feeling quite accomplished. I'd thrown up my grandfather's rubbish, disposed of unwanted stuff at a local charity shop in town, who were thrilled to receive some of my grandmother's old clothes that they described as vintage.
Some of these clothes from the 60s or 70s, they told me, are very collectible, you know.
I cleaned up the entire farmhouse, and I have to say, it shone like a brand new pin. Floors had been polished, carpets had been hoovered, everything had been scrubbed and cleaned to perfection. You could have eaten your dinner off the toilet seat or on the floor. That was how scrupulously clean the place was. There wasn't a cobweb in sight, or even a mouse dropping anywhere. The house almost looked like a show home, despite, of course, the fact that some of the furnishings were rather outdated. But if those antique couches had been recovered in more in the vogue fabrics, you could bring them back to the 21st century without much trouble. The farmhouse smelt of lavender wood polish and a lovely natural rose bouquet that infused all the rooms. It was a natural air freshener I had bought at Macy's once, and I used it all around my grandfather's house. I called the estate agent, Mr. Edmund Brown, around to the property to give it the once-over and a brief assessment for me. He was a quiet, unassuming man, in his early 60s, I believe, with a shock of white hair on his head and piercing blue eyes that looked right through you. He was wearing a pinstriped, rather debonair grey suit, a white cotton shirt, and a paisley tie, along with a pair of rather trendy-looking pointed crocodile shoes. He seemed fully satisfied that my grandfather's place was now suitable to be finally put on the market,
and was pleased by how good the place actually looked. "It should sell easily now. It looks very well presented, thanks to you," he told me. I'd informed my father that I'd completed the job, and he sighed with relief, glad he didn't have to make that trip all the way from Australia to attend to his late father's property. "You're a gem, Haley. You really are. I don't know what I would have done without you. You've taken all the heartbreak out of this situation for me." "It's a pleasure, Dad," I told him, and this time I really did mean it. I thought cleaning up after my grandfather would be an unpleasant, laborious and unenviable job, but I'd felt a certain amount of satisfaction, having transformed a pigsty into a desirable country home. Moreover, I had thoroughly enjoyed my time out here. I'd spent several enjoyable evenings with Gus and Maggie at their home. Gus taught me how to play beginner's chess, as well as teaching me how to play bridge, 2 games he regularly played with my grandfather, to keep their brains young. I also met Rose and Eli Falconer, and learnt all about the funeral she had had for her pet guinea pig that she'd called Oswald. "Oh, Oswald was so precious to me," she told me, dipping her head sadly. "I believe our animals should also have a send-off much like our own. Why should they be deprived of that?" she told me. "They also have spirits, you know, just like we do. I know without Oswald in our lives, life will never be quite the same for the both of us. It was so tragic losing him like that, finding him dead in his den one morning." Eli nodded in agreement. "What can you do? Death comes for us all in the end," he said. Ostensibly, despite what Maggie had told me about the Falconers, I very much doubted that they were responsible for arranging the stones over my grandfather's dead corpse and covering his body with flowers. I had other ideas as to who had done that for my grandfather, but I kept those clandestine thoughts all to myself. On the day I was due to return home, I had one last thing to do, and that was to scatter my grandfather's ashes in the woodgrove. I'd bought flowers from town, and intended to perform my own little ceremony for him in the woods. After reading his journal, I felt incredibly close to my grandfather, and I thought he deserved his own little private ceremony. I'd taken a stroll in the woods on a couple of occasions, after working hard in the farmhouse, but I'd seen no sight or sound of the Bigfoot my grandfather had talked about in his journal, and I don't mind admitting I was a tad disappointed about that. But I had to remind myself that my grandfather had lived on this property for many years, and a Bigfoot had watched over him and physically shown herself to him once. I had been staying at the farmhouse for 1 week, so the chances of seeing the evasive, rather elusive creature were rather remote, and I guess I reconciled myself to this fact. I trudged into the woodgrove with a very heavy heart. I was very sad that the farmhouse would be soon put on the market, sad I'd never come back to this beautiful place again, that had grown on me over the last few days, and even got under my skin. My apartment in Boston had never made me feel as connected as this. Having said that, I knew I would come back to this enchanting, prepossessing rural town again, to visit Maggie and Gus, who said I was welcome to stay with them whenever I wished, and some of the locals like the Falconers, who in only 1 week had succeeded in worming their way into my heart. I had found the locals to be warm and very welcoming, people who wore their hearts on their sleeves and were so in tune with Mother Nature. I had not missed my home in Boston as I thought I would, and today I'd be sad to make that 11-hour trek back home. The woodgrove looked incredibly beguiling in the soft light of the early morning. The lofty trees were resplendently ablaze with colours like rich reds, golds, russets and orange leaves that adorned the boughs of the trees, almost as if the entire woodgrove had purposely dressed up in its finery, just to bid my grandfather farewell. I could see why my grandfather would want his ashes scattered here. I really could. The earthen floor was covered with a confetti of colourful leaves, which I kicked up reflectively as I walked down the earthen paths, with my thoughts entirely focused on my grandfather and his precious memory. I observed a squirrel darting from one branch to another, its nose twitching, its dark beady eyes pinned on me. I could hear the trill of the pretty birdsong in the valley, and that was when I heard something else, moving towards me, heavy, ponderous feet, that were also kicking up the leaves like I had been doing. And then there she was, standing several feet away from me. In that moment, I thought I had to be seeing things. I was tempted to rub my eyes to check that I was indeed wide awake.
but I knew what I was seeing was real. It was the female Bigfoot that my grandfather obviously knew. And she was a remarkably beautiful creature, majestic, lofty, incredibly magnificent. A wind blew through her long flowing hair. There was a dark brown colour with an auburn hue. The creature had a remarkably human face. She seemed a little shy at first, and then indicated for me to follow her. Kilakikwa! It's time, she told me, in a language that I seemed to understand for some incomprehensible reason. Kilontwa! Sikashoko! He's here with us, your grandfather, she told me. Kiloko shakasina! Kolomakisi! I'll show you where he wants his ashes scattered. The Bigfoot led me to the most beautiful resplendent oak tree that I'd ever seen in my life. Your grandfather loved this tree, she told me. Kotakika omokola. The Bigfoot got onto her haunches and dug up the soil with her hands, and then she asked me to spill the ashes into the soil, which is exactly what I did. We covered the ashes with soil, and both scattered the flowers I'd brought over the spot. For a moment, me and the Bigfoot stood together staring at the spot where my grandfather's ashes had been laid to rest. I think we were both mentally saying our goodbyes to him. It felt so natural standing next to her, almost as if I'd known her all my life. The Bigfoot then patted me on the back very gently and brushed away some pollen that had stuck to my shirt. Her soulful brown eyes met mine for a moment. They were the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen. Gilakwi sakoshona, gilani koso kanaki, akulo makasa. He told me to tell you thanks for cleaning up his place. He's gone now, she said. He's got a big smile on his face. He's at peace. The Bigfoot then tapped me gently on the back once more and said, Kilaniko, masikasho. Thanks for doing this. And then I watched her gliding away. She glanced over at me briefly, nodding her head, and then she was gone. I had to pinch myself and say, Are you sure that happened? But I assure you, it really did. For some reason, spending a week at my grandfather's house had changed me. The following week there was a knock at my door in Boston, a salesman trying to sell me some of his cleaning products. And I surprised myself by saying, No, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. That was a breakthrough moment for me. I was no longer the people-pleaser that kept saying yes to everyone. I had finally found some backbone. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, a woman sat in the bar in a small rural American town, where on this unlikely day the stranger was very conspicuous to all the regulars, whom had never seen her before a day in their lives, although they pretended to be focused on their beers or caught up in the mists of their earnest conversations with friends. Their curious eyes could not help but waver in her direction, for much like a cadaver dog could smell out the presence of a dead corpse, the seasoned locals could smell out a new stranger in town a mile off, for in this very rural part of North Carolina, visitors were few and far between. Suffice to say, when they arrived in town, they would ultimately be viewed with a touch of suspicion. Tongues would invariably wag, and people would naturally gossip, especially old Mrs. Meg Riley, who had a tongue on her that would make the wiggling worm at the end of a fisherman's line look as if it was stoically still. If Meg was in the bar right now, her hawk-like brown eyes would be drilling into the stranger with an unbridled inquisitiveness that was not even subtly restrained, for Meg wore her heart on her sleeve and could be brazenly impertinent if needs must. In truth, she'd get the scoop on this mysterious woman in a heartbeat, but at present she was recovering at home from a bout of pneumonia, while her long-suffering husband Reuben was patiently attending to her every need and waiting on her hand and foot, hoping and praying with all his heart that she'd be out and about soon. Ostensibly keeping Meg motivated to stay in bed was rather like restraining a rambunctious puppy dog. It wasn't easy by any manner of means, and that woman was quite literally the world's worst patient, for indeed she did not take kindly to being trussed up in bed. She wanted to be out there, getting her fingers messy, caught up into every pie. But when Meg was in tip-top health, you could not keep a good dog down, even if you tried. She'd be around and about, sniffing in every corner, making sure she thoroughly investigated every new scent, including this new stranger in town. Let's just say you certainly did not need a local newspaper when you had Meg Riley around to fill you in on all the juicy gossip, to let you know what's what. By all accounts, she'd make any hardened journalists seem slow on the uptake, and probably put them to shame in the process by showing up their adept inefficiency. In regards to this curiously intriguing newcomer in town, who had breezed into the bar like an exotic butterfly on the wind, there was something admirably ballsy about a woman doing that, who was unknown by the locals, just walking into the bar on her own accord. Well, that's what Ethan MacDouglas could not help privately thinking to himself, as he cleaned up the glasses behind the oakwood bar, using a glass cloth, and lifting them in the air to examine them more thoroughly, as he inspected them closely for any smudges, and painstakingly buffed them up until they shone. Customers could be punctilious in this bar, and Ethan wanted to make sure that every single glass sparkled with new life, as he liked to deliver the best possible service to his customers, so that they kept coming back. And it would seem his bar was always abuzz with locals, from Monday to Sunday every day of the week. People in town thoroughly enjoyed their local watering hole, and Ethan's bar was never quiet. Ethan busied himself behind the bar on this Saturday evening, poured out beers and alcoholic beverages for anyone requiring prompt, efficient service. Sometimes one or two of the friendly locals would sit down on bar stools opposite him, thoroughly enjoying talking to him as he worked. This newcomer in town seemed blindly oblivious or indifferent to the attention she'd caused, and the question she aroused in people's minds was, who was she, and what was she doing in their town? The moment she entered the bar, the chorus of people's chatter had died down significantly, like that quintessential moment in the theatre when everybody becomes incredibly quiet, before the curtains finally swish open, and the actors suddenly appear on the stage, as the audience are finally silenced. For a brief moment they hold their breath to see what's about to happen next, as the drama begins to unfold. This is the same effect the stranger created, as she swanned into the bar, with not a hint of self-consciousness or reservation, and she made a beeline for a table in the far corner, next to the window that overlooked the street. Everyone seemed to watch her as she sank comfortably down into the seat, and then opened up her purse to retrieve her cell phone, which she scooped up into her hands and appeared to be studying closely, obliviously unaware that she had become the central stage of everyone's focus. To look at if you were a guessing man, the woman was relatively young, possibly in her late 20s or early 30s, but age is sometimes difficult to discern in a perfect stranger, especially in a woman. She was neat and tidy, wearing a flowery cotton blouse and a pair of pink trousers that flared at the bottom. There was a chain around her neck that looked like something you might use to tie up the dog, but on her it had been made into an attractive necklace. Her ash blonde hair was pulled away from her face in a routine, very practical ponytail. It would seem her long Irish-looking face remained fixed on the door, as if she was waiting for someone. Ethan MacDouglas, who ran the bar in town and had done so for many long years, knew how to read body language expertly well, a skill you needed in a bar when determining whether an explosive bar fight was about to occur, or when a patron needed to be left well alone. This was not the time to ask the stranger if she wanted a drink. She was clearly waiting for someone, so he'd respect that. She glanced down at the message interface of her cell phone, and up at the door again. It was early May, and the nights were still a little nippy, but spring had begun to paint the natural world with a beguiling pastel palette of soft pinks, yellows, apricots and whites, seen in so many of the trees that were now fully in blossom, and the stone-washed grass that had been so depressingly bleached and sad-looking after having weathered a harrowing winter, and was now bursting with abundant life, and the landscape was beginning to look green again after the first rains of the season. The time was exactly 5 minutes past 7, and the woman's face appeared as expressionless as a blank piece of white paper, which meant she was close to impossible to read. She stared abstractly at the door. Who was she waiting for, Ethan secretly wondered, not wanting to admit to himself that he was being a wee bit nosy. But wasn't it natural to be curious about a stranger you'd never seen before, especially when they were not all that common in these parts anyway? What was wrong with being a little inquisitive? Anyway, the truth was that Ethan had always kept even a hint of curiosity rather cloak and dagger. But Meg Riley always wore her nosiness in plain sight, like a conspicuous red dress that you couldn't miss. If only she was in the bar right now, she'd have already pounced on this stranger and extracted out all her information, faster than you could say Jack Robinson. And by now, over a free pint of craft beer, Meg would be telling Ethan who the young lady actually was, and what she was doing in their town. But not tonight. Ethan would have to figure out that curious conundrum all by himself, and he was not a man that was good at playing guessing games. The woman seemed to be examining her fingernails very closely, a little apprehensively perhaps, and began to nibble one of them in a nervous gesture, although Ethan was not certain that she was actually anxious. Perhaps she was a tad impatient, having to wait for someone who had not turned up yet. That could be very annoying. 3 minutes later the door of the bar swung open, and a young man entered. Ethan knew this man only too well. This was Eddie Tanner, who was 28 years old, lean, with a perfectly symmetrical face, a square jawline, dimples on either side of his mouth, and for some incongruous reason that Ethan could not comprehend, woman found irresistible. Ethan reasoned that if he was a woman, he would not fall for the charms of Eddie Tanner. But women melted when they were around Eddie, always declaring that he ought to be in the movies, and that he'd give Tom Cruise a run for his money, because he was so good-looking. They would drool almost shamelessly over Eddie, as if he was the most delectable chocolate cake they had seen in the baker's window, that they were absolutely longing to eat, even if the tight waistband they were wearing around their middle was screaming at them, "Not a good idea! Not a good idea! Any more of those chocolate cakes and I might just explode!" It didn't do Eddie Tanner any good either, to have women falling all over him like confetti over a bride. Ethan privately mused to himself. Ethan could not see the attraction that woman had towards the likes of Eddie Tanner, but he continually reminded himself he was not a woman, so he was not seeing Eddie through feminine eyes. But he was sure if he could, he wouldn't be easily won over by the man's charms. "It's those dimples around his mouth, and those ocean blue eyes, of course, that make women crumble at the knees," Meg Riley had told him once. Meg always had an answer to any enigmatic question that would plague your mind, like an annoying fly you seriously needed to swat away. "Of course I'm not like most women," Meg had told him with a haughty pride. "I'd never be seduced by the likes of Eddie Tanner. You may laugh because I'm in my 70s now, but let me tell you, in my day, I was quite the looker. People's always turned their heads in my direction when I'd walk past, and if Eddie had been around back then, I would not have been remotely beguiled by him. But then again, I've always been far more discerning than the average woman. I'm not easily swayed by good looks, you see. I'm far more particular in what I look for in a man, which is why I ended up marrying my husband Reuben. God broke the mould when he made my Reuben. That husband of mine is a rare treasure, let me tell you." "And why would that be, Meg?" Ethan had asked her with a twinkle in his eye. "Why would Eddie Tanner be unable to seduce you, if you were in your late 20s again? Go on, I'm interested. Let me hear it." Meg raised a brow. "Don't tell me you don't know, Ethan. It's because Eddie Tanner has been through more women than I've had hot dinners, and what's more, he has no shame about it whatsoever. In truth, a man who throws himself around the place indiscriminately, like a golf ball on a green, always trying to aim for the hole-in-one. He really doesn't have much class, does he? A man like that, with such a lascivious reputation, cannot be trusted as far as you can throw him. In truth, Eddie Tanner seems to think he's some kind of a Casanova, or worse still, a demigod, and he absolutely is not. Now, if you want my opinion, it's some of the local lasses that have made him believe that he's all that, swooning over him as if he's Marlon Brando. I mean, honestly, do they have no shame or self-respect? I've heard some women, local women, whose names I shall not mention to you, have sent Eddie Tanner some very inappropriate pictures of themselves, on their cell phones, I might add, if you get my drift.
Now, in my day, if you did something like that, you'd be considered a very loose woman indeed, without any moral fabric whatsoever. But I ask you, what woman in her right mind would do such an outrageous thing like that anyway? Those pictures, suggestive pictures I might say, if they ended up in the wrong hands, could ruin a young lady's life and reputation. Yet hindsight is something these youngsters fail to engage in these days, and more's the pity if you ask me. You're not wrong about that, Meg. Ethan had wholeheartedly agreed. He knew if he had a daughter around Eddie's age, he wouldn't allow her anywhere near that man. Meg was right. He was the kind of man that was every father's worst nightmare when it came to watching over the safety of their daughters. Eddie had a mop of black shiny hair and a dazzling smile that had charmed many a local lass to her detriment. Ethan shook his head when Eddie entered the bar. He knew Eddie Tanner's reputation all too well. He was considered quite the player. Why wasn't Ethan remotely surprised? If anyone would be setting himself on a date and putting himself out there with a rather cocky swagger, it would be Eddie Tanner, the town's quintessential heartbreaker. Eddie knew he was attractive. That was part of the problem. He exploited it to his own advantage and used women, and then when he was bored of them, he spat them out. Yet despite everything, Ethan could not help having a secret admiration for Eddie's assertive confidence. Eddie Tanner stood up proud and tall in the bar, at easily over 6 foot tall. He was glancing up and down, but the woman made no effort to get Eddie Tanner's attention, even when she saw him. Instead, she continued to sit on the upholstered chair near the window, glancing out at the street and at her cell phone, until Eddie Tanner had seen her. And when he did, his eyes glanced over towards her, and he cast her one of his irresistible smiles, and walked over to greet her. It's as I thought, Ethan mused to himself. The woman has probably agreed to meet up with Eddie Tanner on one of those dating apps. I hope she knows what she's let herself in for, and that she's not taken in by those baby blue eyes of his, and those cute dimples. Are you Sinead? Eddie asked the young woman. Yes, that's right. I'm Sinead. I'm Eddie Tanner. I'm sorry I'm dreadfully late, but I got waylaid with my brother. He needed a helping hand with some of his steers. I couldn't come to the bar with all that muck that I had over my shoes. I'd be trailing in filth everywhere, so I had to go back home and have a quick shower. You don't have to apologize to me. You're here now, and that's what counts, said the woman politely. Eddie asked the young woman what she wanted to drink, and went over to Ethan at the bar to make the order. On a date, are you? Asked Ethan, giving Eddie the once-over. I hope you're not going to break the young woman's heart, like you've done every other woman in town, he said, with a note of sarcasm. She looks like a nice girl. I hope you don't hurt her. Eddie lifted a brow. He looked rather amused. As if, he said. I can't think what you mean, Ethan. For the record, I'm the perfect gentleman. That's not what I heard. Meg Riley told me if she was your age, she would not date you for all the tea in China. Good job. I wouldn't date her either, said Eddie. Thank God she's not my age. I feel sorry with poor old Reuben having to put up with the likes of her. Imagine being married to such a busybody. The man is a glutton for punishment, if you ask me. I heard she's sick with the flu. Pneumonia, I believe she's got. Jolly good thing, if you ask me. I can imagine she'd be all over my date, like a bad case of chicken pox if she was around. What will it be? Asked Ethan, attending to Eddie's order and ignoring his comments. The woman had picked a margarita. Interesting choice, Eddie had privately thought. But if the cocktail was supposed to give him any indication or clues about the new woman in town, it certainly did not. In the brief moments of their interaction, he had gleaned nothing about her. But unlike other women who had so easily bored him rigid in the past, he found himself wanting to know more about her. For some bizarre reason, she rather intrigued him. Women never really had that effect on him. Most were pretty uninteresting in his book, beyond their attractive veneer as far as he was concerned. But this woman was remarkably different. She was pretty enough, of course, but he'd dated far prettier women than her before.
So it wasn't that which had grabbed his attention. It was something else that had aroused his curiosity, sparked his interest, and left him second-guessing. Suffice to say, normally dates he acquired online were just fleeting interactions with women who would be like passing ships in the night. But he didn't mind if this new ship stayed anchored in their small town indefinitely. He was champing at the bit to get to know this woman a whole lot better. Had he not felt a spark between them, or was that just wishful thinking? He couldn't be sure. The woman at the table was patting her beer mat with her fingernails, and looked more peppy when Eddie returned to the table, with a margarita in his hand. The outer flute serenaded with a long line of salt, and he parked it in front of her. Then he comfortably slouched in the chair opposite hers, with his craft beer in his hand. He had chosen a beer Ethan had recommended, but on the tongue it was more bitter than he would have liked. It would have been far safer to order a drink he was well acquainted with. But tonight was not about playing safe. Tonight was about living dangerously in the moment and going with the flow of the wind to see where it takes you. Because this peppery woman, if she were an easterly wind, she could take him anywhere she liked, Eddie thought indulgently to himself. So tell me about yourself, he asked her. Normally he'd ask this question with an apathetic indifference, because he wasn't really interested in the answer. When you were chatting up women, you had to ask those obvious questions that were in the manuscript of successful romantic liaisons that would lead to a passionate outcome. But this time Eddie really was interested in what this woman had to say. The curiosity he had about her bubbled up inside him like a whistling kettle on the hob that was hard to subdue. There is nothing really to tell. Oh, I doubt that, he said, taking a glug of his beer and recoiling at the taste. Some of the white foam had trespassed over the side of the glass and was rolling steadily down like a single tear. He wiped it away with his finger nonchalantly, his inquiring eyes attentively fixed on the woman. Well, you've moved here, haven't you? I believe you brought Ned's old place. Isn't that what you said on the chat to me? Not exactly. I'm Ned's niece. He left the place to my father, you see. My father told me it was mine if I wanted it. My dad's not interested in the old place. So I decided to move into the farmhouse, she said, tapping her glass with her fingernails, so that the glass chimed a musical tune. What did you do that for? What do you mean? Well, moving into Ned's old place, of course. Even your father clearly did not want to move into his brother's farmhouse. You're young. This is a rural small town. People usually move away from here, not to a place like this. You're not here for work, are you? This town's not exactly buoyant or flush with job opportunities. And when they do come up, the townsfolk look out for each other first, before hiring a complete stranger. It's how it works around here. People look after their own. You know how it is. An inverted loyalty. That's what it is. Besides, most people around here, well, they're rather suspicious of strangers. The woman nodded solemnly, taking a cautionary sip of her margarita. A touch of her peachy lipstick smeared the outer edge of the glass. That's not something that worries me. I like it out here in the countryside, and I think I can make something out of my father's late brother's place. Fix it up a little, perhaps. It's got great potential to be a cosy farmhouse, that's for sure. Good luck with that, said Eddie, raising a sceptical brow. I imagine it's going to be needing lots of tender loving care, general maintenance and upkeep, and that's not going to be a breezy walk in the park, let me tell you. I'm not afraid of a little hard work, she said, giving him an almost conspiratorial smile. I was looking to move somewhere anyway, and when Ned died and left the old place to my dad, I was hardly going to look a gift horse in the mouth, was I? Especially when my father offered the place to me. I believe in the serendipitous events in life, and when they cross your path like the arbitrary hands in a compass nudging you to go in this providential direction, if you follow their favourable unpremeditated lead, you'll never be disappointed. She paused for a brief moment in sober reflection. That's when you're meant to go, you see. It's fate beckoning for you to follow her lead, and resisting that powerful persuasive nudge. That's what causes people to become stuck. That's how I see it anyway. It's rather like riding a horse, loosening the reins, and allowing that horse to lead you where it wants to take you. So I guess the horse led me to this little town. And the way I look at it, I'm obviously meant to be here for some reason."
"Well, that's an interesting way to look at it,"
said Eddie. He drank his bitter beer as he listened to the young woman's words. He never heard anyone speak like her before. She had pretty much told him that she'd go where the wind took her, like a dandelion seed. Was that not a little like playing Russian roulette with your life, he thought to himself. He wasn't sure this woman was actually a good fit for this town. She stuck out like a sore thumb, not in a bad way, of course, but because she was rather quirky and idiosyncratic, and maybe that is what he was beginning to rather like about her. She did not conform to the personality type of other women he'd dated in the past, and her wild, untamed spirit had rather captivated him. It would seem this date had gotten on to a fine start, with their light-hearted exchange, going much deeper than previous conversations he'd had with women in the past that had been so much more superficial. Eddie, until now, had never really done deep. Furthermore, the woman wasn't giving him that adoring, doting look he'd always received from other females. On the contrary, she didn't seem to be beguiled by him in the slightest, or remotely enamoured by his looks, and bizarrely that made her all the more attractive in his eyes. In the beginning he'd found her pretty enough, but now as he was getting to know her more and more, he found her bewitching, mesmerising even, and fascinating for sure.
"If you don't mind my asking you, how are you going to make a living out here, Sinead? In a small town, not exactly that generous to strangers like yourself. How are you going to pay for the fixing-up project you're clearly embarking upon? Because restoring Ned's old place into tip-top condition is not going to come cheap, let me tell you."
The woman did not answer Eddie's intrusive question. Instead, she jiggled the crushed ice in her margarita, like the rice in a baby's rattle, as her eyes stared down at the ice, as if for a moment she was meditating on his words. Eddie, suddenly realizing the rude impertinence of his intrusive remark, took an uncomfortable swig of his beer, held back a rather impolite burp that was about to come out of his throat, and said, "I'm sorry. Forgive me, Sinead. It's none of my business. I shouldn't ask you such a direct personal question. I'm just interested, but you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. I certainly respect your privacy." The woman raised a brow. "You're not afraid to come out with what you're thinking, are you? If you must know, I thought it would do me good to begin my life again, with a brand new start. I love the countryside, you see. I'm a writer. I make a living writing fictional stories. I had a couple of lucky breaks with 3 bestsellers, and so that's why I'm here. When you're a writer, you need peace and quiet, and a beautiful environment that can inspire you all the more. As I told you, the hands of fate moved me in this direction, which is why I'm here. Whether I will stay in this small town is debatable, of course, but in the meantime I can write my next book here, and hopefully restore Ned's farmhouse. And if I decide to move on, I'll probably sell the place. It'll be an interesting project at the very least. Later I might choose to move somewhere by the coast. I love the ocean, you see. Somewhere like Cape Elizabeth in Maine, perhaps, or Anna Maria Island in Florida. Those would be my second choices, I suspect."
Eddie looked impressed. 2 bestsellers? You're kidding me.
3 bestsellers.
3 bestsellers? That's nothing to be sneezed at. I'm very impressed. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking?
I'm 32.
You're 4 years older than I am, said Eddie. I've always had an eye for the older woman, he teased, giving her a cheeky wink.
4 years, please, she said, rolling her eyes. I'd hardly say that makes me an older woman. We're still from the same generation, aren't we? And that's what counts. You know what they say, date within your generation, and then things won't usually go awry. It's huge generational gaps that can be problematic, although for some people it works, but it probably wouldn't for me.
So are you going to tell me about the books you write? I'm very interested in that, I have to say.
I'd rather not, if you don't mind, she told him frankly. That's why I like being a writer. I don't write under my real name, like J.K. Rowling and people like that. I'd never do that, she said defiantly. Never. I prefer to be able to live my life as freely and privately as the next person, without people knowing who I am. I made that very clear to my publishers from the very beginning. I don't want to be doing book signings and stuff like that. I don't want to draw unnecessary attention to myself. That is not me. I like being anonymous. It works for me better that way."
"So you're quite shy?"
then Eddie asked the young woman. "No, I wouldn't say that at all. Yes, I am reticently private. I love my own space. I'm not afraid to be on my own. On the contrary, I embrace being on my own. When you're a writer, that's pretty much your entire life. You're alone for a lot of the time. You have to be. You need the space and the privacy to write. And you can't afford distractions because they can sabotage your focus, and then you won't get to write anything at all. Also, it helps to be surrounded by the beauty of the natural world because it can inspire your creative juices to flow. It really helps, I can tell you that."
"Well, that makes sense to me," said Eddie. "But don't you get lonely?"
"Writing is a lonely profession. Any author will tell you that. How can you be a successful writer surrounded with hundreds of distractions? You'd never, ever get anything done, as I keep telling you. I'd not have it any other way. If you love what you do, it's difficult to stop doing it. And besides, when I'm writing, I don't feel lonely at all. I feel as if I'm living my life through my characters I create. And sometimes the experiences are better than real life. And the best part of it all is you decide what will become of those characters. So in a way, you play God in those stories."
"I think I understand what you're saying. It makes a weird kind of sense to me, I suppose. So what do you write?"
"Thrillers and suspense stories, of course. There's usually a grisly murder involved, a twist to the plot. And the person you think murdered the victim might actually be innocent. I like to create plenty of cliffhangers in my stories, you see, to keep up the suspense. And, of course, people's attention. That's important."
"Sounds very interesting. And tell me about yourself."
"Why do you keep asking me so many questions when I haven't even been able to ask you any of my own?" said the woman, with a note of indignance in her voice.
"Fire away, Sinead," said Eddie, taking a sip of his beer. "What would you like to ask me? You can ask me anything you like."
The woman ran her eyes over Eddie, as if she was trying to figure him out, but she didn't look satisfied that she had got the answers. "What do you do?" she asked. "For a living, I mean. You mentioned helping your brother out with the steers. Are you some kind of a rancher?"
"No, my brother's into that. He's a rancher. He runs my father's old ranch. He's married to his wife Myrtle. But me, I live in an apartment in town, which I share with my younger brother Keegan. We're both plumbers by profession, and run our own plumbing business together."
"Oh, so I know who to call if I have a leaking tap," said the woman, raising a brow. "How interesting. I'd never have seen you as a plumber. Do you like what you do?"
"Absolutely not. I don't enjoy fixing up blocked toilets or drains. It can be a messy, smelly business, I can assure you. But I do what I do because it brings in the dough, if you know what I mean. Why does anyone work after all?"
"But surely you get some kind of job satisfaction from what you do."
"Not really. I do what I do because I'm good with my hands. It pays the bills. But it doesn't mean I enjoy it."
"That's so sad," said the woman. "I think people should be passionate about what they do for a living. I know I am."
"Oh, but I'm passionate," said Eddie. "Very passionate. Passionate about making lots of money. The way I see it, people might hate the job they do, but are passionate about the money they make. And that's what drives them forward. That's what gets them out of their beds in the morning to answer their next call out."
"I get your point, but I still think job satisfaction is incredibly important in life. I couldn't imagine spending years and years doing something I loathed. I'd absolutely hate that. It would be so destroying."
"Some of us don't have much of a choice. Believe me, millions of people do things that they loathe. There are people out there flipping burgers, emptying bedpans, or like me, fixing up dirty toilets. And they do what they do to survive, to make a living, to pay their bills, to put food in their bellies. It is what it is. And no one said it's pretty. If you must know, Sinead, I don't think we're here on earth to be happy. We're here to overcome the hurdles that life throws at us. And some of those hurdles are not for the faint-hearted. On the contrary, I think those hurdles define who we become as people one day. I mean, look at the great explorers. I don't believe for a minute they enjoyed climbing the highest mountains. I mean, think about the monumental struggles they had to overcome. Exhaustion, fatigue, hunger, issues with oxygen, painful joints, freezing conditions, throbbing headaches. I could go on and on. My point is, when you get to the top, you feel amazing. They have vanquished a monumental hurdle, they have, and lived to tell the world about it. It's the same for people who sail around the world. You hear about it all the time. They don't enjoy the process, but they love the challenge. They enjoy overcoming adversity and emerging victorious. It makes them feel alive. They have conquered, overcome, surmounted, succeeded. And that's a high you don't get from drugs, let me tell you. If they could bottle that feeling in a bottle, those bottles would be sold out in a heartbeat.
You make an interesting point, Eddie, said the woman. I think life is about surmounting hurdles. You're right about that. Believe it or not, I get them with my writing. And that happens to me more than I care to admit. The woman rattled her ice in her margarita glass, as Eddie realized she needed another drink. And so 3 drinks later, both Eddie and his date were slightly more bladdered, which helped the conversation flow even more easily. And the more the couple talked together, the more comfortable Eddie felt with this young woman. Almost as if he'd known her all his life. Never in his wildest dreams would he think a man like himself would be drawn to a fictional author of all things. That he would never have envisaged happening. Eddie lived in a world that was far from fictional, and had never possessed any imagination whatsoever. Well, so he'd been told by his English teacher in school, in no uncertain terms when he was a boy. At school he'd handed in an essay that had been such a bitter disappointment to the teacher, she'd embarrassed Eddie by making him read the essay out to the entire class, and she told them all categorically that this is how not to write an essay. After being humiliated publicly by his English teacher for his appalling ability to string words together in a fluid sequence of meaningful banter, Eddie had turned his back on all things fictional, and even movies on Netflix, if they were not based on truth, seemed to fail to hold his attention. But Eddie found himself locked under this woman's spell, a woman who made her living by making up stories. It was almost laughable, he thought to himself privately. The universe sure did have a warped sense of humour. Through the process of the long, rather pleasant evening, against the sound of people's chirruping voices, that created a cheerful background buzz, and the clatter of cutlery, the couple began to talk in earnest. The woman found out that Eddie had no idea where his biological mother was. She'd bogged off when Eddie was only 10 years old. On occasion she'd sent him presents and phoned him, from where she lived in Atlanta. But Eddie didn't know why she bothered to call him at all, for she never seemed interested in reconnecting. So Eddie had pretty much written her off. His father was retired, living in Maine with his new wife Anna, and had handed over the reins of the ranch to his older brother. Eddie had learnt about plumbing from his best friend's father when he was a kid, and somehow before long he found himself a dab hand at being able to help the locals with a leaking tap or a burst pipe. And now he and his younger brother both ran their own conjoined plumbing business, with the logo on the van that read, "When your drain is being naughty, call 444 4040. And then at the bottom of the logo it said, "The Tanner Brothers, we're here to fix the dirty problems you always want to avoid. Give us a call." The woman let out a huge yawn and covered her mouth apologetically. "I'm not bored by your company at all," she said. "Not at all. On the contrary, Eddie, I've thoroughly enjoyed myself this evening. And I didn't expect to, I hasten to say. I thought you'd be very boring, but on the contrary, I've been pleasantly surprised." Eddie looked surprised. "You thought I'd be boring?" he asked incredulously. "Why the hell would you think that, based on my profile?" "I don't know," said the woman. "I saw your picture on the dating app, and I very nearly didn't contact you. I thought, my God, here is a man who thinks he's all that. Snaps his fingers and the woman come running. I thought you'd be one of those egotistical types, with only a one-night stand on your mind. I thought we'd have a drink, and that would be that, and we'd invariably part company. I have no interest, you see, in having random flings with strangers. She shuddered in disgust at the very idea. "That bores me rigid. My life is far too interesting to waste my time on nondescript, meaningless and fleeting relationships with people. I'm not into that at all. But you're not shallow like I thought you would be. And well, I'm impressed. Very impressed, actually." Sinead's words made Eddie flush as red as a field of poppies. He hoped she hadn't seen the tips of his ears growing red as well. What Sinead did not know was Eddie had initially hoped this date would end up being a one-night stand. But certainly not any more. Eddie was not interested in this woman like a passing ship in the night, but he wanted to get to know her more, so he intended to be a perfect gentleman. When Eddie learnt that the young woman had taken a taxi to the bar, he thought he would do the chivalrous thing and drop her back home, at Ned's old place, even if it was in a carriage that lacked a great deal of lustre. Eddie's plumber's truck was not exactly the ideal truck to escort a lady in, but in the past none of Eddie's dates had complained about his truck, and nor did Sinead, as she sat gratefully in the seat. "Thanks, I appreciate the lift so much. I didn't fancy calling a taxi." As Eddie drove his vehicle away from the small town, some of the craggy, somewhat bumpy, remote sequestered roads became decidedly dark, as the inauspicious moonlight on this night was not exactly friendly, so all they could really see ahead of them was Eddie's headlights. Eddie did not bat an eyelid. He had grown up in these parts and was well used to navigating roads in the pitch black, and was not intimidated in the slightest. It would take more to intimidate him, that was for sure. Sinead nervously glanced out of the passenger side window. Her shoulders tightened, her back stiffened, and her heart beat a little faster. She became infinitely more tense, but Eddie understood why. If you weren't from this part of the world, driving down these remote country lanes with little moonlight could be a cautionary experience indeed. "Don't worry," he assured Sinead, who had grown unusually quiet. "It's so dark out there, uncomfortably so. I don't like it at all. I mean, the moonlight is practically non-existent. It's a nightmare."
"I know how you feel, Sinead, but I assure you I know my way around here very well, with my eyes closed, so you're in safe hands. I've been driving these roads since I was a little boy."
It would seem Eddie was right, because before long, after jolting up and down rather precariously on their car seats over bumpy dirt roads, they were soon driving down a very smooth driveway, well, relatively smooth, surrounded by pretty countryside and lofty tall congregations of trees, that in the dark shadows of the night seemed like dense cardboard cutouts on the background. It was about 11:30 at night when Eddie pulled up outside Ned's farmhouse. The good news is that Sinead had seen fit to leave some lights on in the house, along with an outside light, which offered a soft illumination that made her sigh with relief, for the lights certainly succeeded in subduing the darkness. She was thankful to be safely back at Ned's farmhouse, and seeing its familiar ambiguous silhouette against the jet-blackened firmament was the most welcome sight indeed. It would seem that the farmhouse's imperfections were ironed away by the velvet darkness, so that its asymmetrical features seemed pretty close to perfect. But Eddie knew in the officious light of the morning it would be very easy to see that this house was really quite dilapidated and crying out for a great deal of TLC, and obviously needed extensive work done on it. The sash windows were begging to be repaired, as their warped wooden frames needed replacing, and the house itself was longing for a new lick of fresh paint. As Eddie climbed out of his truck and opened up the passenger side door for Sinead, he walked her to the front door and was telling himself he should not go in for coffee, even if she asked him in for one. He couldn't trust himself not to kiss this woman, and it was because he liked her that he didn't want to move in on her like a lion on its prey. He wanted to take things very slowly with Sinead and behave like the perfect gentleman. But Sinead asked him in if he'd like to come in for a coffee. Eddie found it close to impossible to decline such an irresistible invite, but was determined to behave himself. Quirky women like Sinead were a rare treasure that you handled with care, lest she should slip through your fingers.
"I really should be going," he said, glancing at his cell phone. "I mean, it is getting rather late."
"Oh, go on," said Sinead. "A coffee won't kill you. And I have no intention of eating you up, if that's what you're worried about, she teased. I told you, I'm not that kind of girl.
Well, in that case, how can I refuse? Said Eddie, grinning. A coffee would be great.
Meg Riley. Meg was feeling a lot stronger. The doctor had told her she needed to stay in bed to fully recuperate from her bad bout of pneumonia. In the beginning, the condition had gripped her so brutally hard that even if she'd wanted to break free from the bonds of her confinement, she had been held captive under its dominating control, as it had punished her unkindly, rendering her pathetically weak and ridiculously helpless like a new baby. Indeed, there were times she had been so delicate, so physically fragile, that she could barely walk from the bedroom to the bathroom. But there had been a decided improvement in her health today, and she felt a great deal more like her old self. Indeed, she had been surreptitiously walking around her bedroom, behind her husband's back, because if he'd seen her up and about, he would not have been terribly pleased. Her long-suffering husband Reuben had been devotedly standing by her side, attending to her every need, like a dutiful butler, but he would not allow her to do a single thing, and this was beginning to annoy Meg greatly. Meg was currently feeling like a bird with clipped wings, confined to its cage, that was simply longing to fly again, and this longing was becoming like an insatiable itch that she was desperate to scratch. Even though she'd begged her husband to let her have a quick wander in the backyard so that she could clandestinely snoop through the hole in the fence to get a bird's-eye view of the neighbour's front porch. They were an interesting couple who had lived in the adjacent property next to them for years, but they were always having spirited barneys that Meg found highly entertaining to watch, and she loved informing the townsfolk what the couple were fighting about this time. Believe it or not, their last fight had been over chocolate. Of all the things in the entire world to fight over, this was certainly a first. Mrs. Philippa Byzantine had told her husband he'd hidden her chocolate stash. "I know you took it! And you hid it from me! Where did you put it?" she said to him on the porch, pounding her fingers accusingly into his chest, which could not have been comfortable, for Philippa Byzantine had long manicured nails that were as sharp as a tiger's claws. She was always the kind of woman who wore rebellion on her person like a choker chain around her neck. "I want my chocolate right now! I need it! You know I need my chocolate!" she had chortled. "How dare you hide it from me?"
"You're not having any more chocolate, sweetheart. Enough is enough. I'm doing this for your own good. If you eat any more chocolate, you won't fit through the front door." "How dare you! How dare you say that to me?" Philippa cried out. "Are you trying to say that I'm fat? Are you saying I'm fat?" "You said it, not me," her husband answered. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Well, you know where I'm going. I'm going to town to buy myself some more chocolate. Because if I want chocolate, I'm going to have it, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." Meg would watch Philippa Byzantine, marching off to her car, driving away indignantly, revving up the car engine, and accelerating down the street, like someone with an axe to grind. Meg always knew where she was going, to buy replacement chocolates, of course. Meg would find out from the owner of the sweet shop in town exactly what Philippa Byzantine had bought. Last time she had brought 3 chocolate Hershey bars, 1 big Swiss Toblerone, 3 Mars bars, 3 large packets of chocolate chip cookies, a bag of chocolate-covered peanuts, and 3 packets of chocolate Maltesers. And when Meg checked the bin the very next day, she saw the evidence all tucked neatly away in a plastic bag, hidden away from prying eyes. Only Meg's eyes, well, they never missed a trick, did they? "I should have been a sleuth," she would tell herself. "No one can hide anything from me." And she wasn't wrong about that. She had secretly marvelled that Philippa Byzantine could eat so much in a single sitting. Philippa Byzantine was claiming it was a mystery that she kept piling on the weight. "I don't understand," she'd say to the townsfolk. "I eat absolutely nothing. Not a single thing. I barely eat at all. I eat like a little rabbit. And I only have to look at a Hershey kiss, and I put on weight so fast." But everyone knew the truth, thanks to Meg, that Philippa Byzantine ate enough chocolate to sink the Titanic, if the truth be told. But no one told her
They were on to her.
"Meg, sweetheart,"
said her husband, intruding on her thoughts as he entered the bedroom. Meg was pondering how she could slip out of the house behind his back to snoop on the Byzantines.
"You heard what the doctor said,"
her husband said, almost as if he could read her thoughts.
"You're far too weak to go wandering around the backyard, spying on our next-door neighbours. You need lots of rest and plenty of fluid."
"I'm bored silly, trussed up in the bed," Meg had complained, blowing sorrowfully into her tissue and letting out a couple of hoarse coughs. Damn! Why did the back of her throat tickle so much? And why did she sometimes feel unfortunately dizzy when she got out of bed? It wasn't fair. She was tired of being sick.
"See, I told you," said her husband defiantly. "You're in a bad way. That dry cough sounds quite dreadful."
"I'm much better than you think I am," she assured him. "My cough makes me sound ill, but I'm actually feeling relatively perky actually. Much better than I've felt in a long time."
"If that were true, why is your appetite so poor? You've barely eaten a thing in the last few days, and you're constantly falling asleep. In my opinion, your body is still struggling to recover, and you need to give it plenty of time. You need to exercise some patience. I know what you're like, Meg, only too well. You want to be gallivanting around town, snooping into everyone's business. But for once in your life, you're going to have to abide by the doctor's orders. And I have to put my foot down on this. Otherwise, you won't be getting any better."
Meg secretly pooh-poohed her husband's words, and when he wasn't looking, she made a face behind his back. She was tired of being cooped up in the house for so long, and tired of Reuben telling her what to do. But underneath the flaky layers of her denial, she knew her husband was right. She had a way to go before she felt significantly better. Meg's cell phone lit up and began to ring with that annoying ringtone that never bothered Meg in the slightest, because she enjoyed gassing away for hours on end on her phone with her best friend Lisa Malusin, who was doing a fabulous job in keeping her up to date with all the latest town gossip. "Meg, you're not going to believe it. I've got some very interesting news that's going to fascinate you," came Lisa's excited voice. "A young woman has just come into the bar tonight. And guess who she's meeting up with for a date?" "Eddie Tanner?" asked Meg. "Right on the money. I knew you would get it right first time round. The rumour is that she's moved into Ned's old farmhouse. Everyone wishes you were up here right now because you would know exactly who she was and why she's here in town. But no one knows that. She's clearly connected to Ned in some way. It seems like Eddie Tanner is quite taken by her. I've been watching him from the other side of the bar, and let me tell you something for nothing. Eddie is acting very differently towards her compared to other women he's dated in the past. As if he really, really likes her. You know what I mean? Really, really likes her. As if she's the kind of woman that could anchor him to the spot, if you know what I mean." "No, what do you mean?" asked Meg. "You're not explaining yourself terribly well, Lisa. I wish you wouldn't talk in riddles. It's very annoying." "Well, what I'm trying to say, Meg, is I believe he's genuinely interested in what she has to say. And his leg, well, it was nervously twitching. And there was this look in his eyes, like a sparkle. It's hard to explain. But I think Eddie Tanner was falling for her, hook, line and sinker. Can you believe it?" "No, I can't." "What does she look like?" "Well, you know, she's pretty enough, I suppose. But I've seen Eddie around even more attractive women than her. But they haven't made that impression on him, like she has. She's actually making him wobble at the knees. I've never seen anything like it before. It's a spectacle to watch." "But who is she? What's she doing in town?" Lisa let out a laugh. "We would like to know the answers to those enigmatic questions, Meg, but as you're not around, we are none the wiser. But as Ethan was saying, without you in full action mode, none of us are going to know much about her. Anyway, I thought I had to let you know what was going on. I'm not even sure she's moved into Ned's old place. At the moment, it's a rumour, but I'm imagining it's probably correct." So they're there at the bar now? Asked Meg curiously. Eddie and this mystery woman, they're still there? Oh, absolutely. I'm watching them as I speak and as I drink my vodka, said Lisa, purring happily into the phone. But I haven't got your brass balls, Meg. I really wish I did. I'd never have the guts to go up to her and give her the 3rd degree like you would do if you were here. After Lisa's revelations, Meg began twitching restlessly in her bed. She couldn't bear being confined to her bedroom a moment longer like this. Enough was enough. She was sleeping in the spare bedroom while she recuperated, as her incessant dry coughing had kept her husband Reuben wide awake. She missed not sharing a bed with him. There was nothing pleasant about being ill. Meg's desire to learn more about the strange girl in town was practically suffocating her. She needed answers to her questions, and she needed answers now, and those answers just could not wait. Who was she, this new arrival? What was she doing here anyway? How did she intend to make a living? How was she related to the recently deceased Ned Oldman? How old was she? Where was she from? Why had she moved here? How long did she intend to stay? What did she look like? And why was Eddie Tanner so captivated by her? Furthermore, what did this woman actually think about Eddie Tanner? Was she nurturing a pathetic crush like so many other women had done? Or was this woman a little more discerning than most? If Eddie was so taken by her, she clandestinely suspected that this woman was not cooing at his every word. In her wizened experience, men always wanted what they couldn't have. It was their inborn hunting instinct. Meg knew that she needed to find out these answers for herself. She wanted them now, to satiate her insatiable curiosity, which was so itchy, if she didn't scratch it now, it would practically drive her completely insane. She had been born a journalist, even though she wasn't one, because Meg knew how to extract information out of people, like a bee removes nectar from a flower. Meg knew what needed to be done. It would be what any skillful, self-respecting journalist would do in the circumstances when they could smell a story on the wind, stop at nothing to acquire it. She would drive to the wooded clearing near Ned's old farmhouse. She would then amble over to the farmhouse to ask the mystery woman if she could borrow her telephone to call her husband, because she could pretend her car wasn't working, that the engine had seized up, and her cell phone was on the blink. She masterfully practiced the lines in her head, like a hardened professional. "Oh, hello there! Oh, I am so dreadfully sorry to bother you, especially at this time of night. My name's Meg Riley. I'm from the town. My engine, would you believe it, it's seized up, not far from your farmhouse. I was driving around, you see, looking for my little cat who appears to have just disappeared. And my cell phone is on the blink. That dreadful thing of mine never works. I must get a new one. My husband's always telling me so. Do you mind awfully if I impose on you and come in? And if I could borrow your phone to call my husband to come and rescue me. My car's not parked terribly far away from your farmhouse. It's in the wooded clearing over there. I also would very much appreciate a glass of water. My throat is terribly dry. As I say, I'm so sorry to disturb you like this at this late time." This way the kind woman, who would clearly be very sympathetic, would invite her in, offering her a coffee, while Meg skillfully pretended to call her husband to pick her up. And then she would act like she was going back to her car to wait for him, after of course expunging all the information she needed out of this stranger. At a guess, she assumed the woman would likely be back from the bar in town after about 11:30, and that was when she would pounce on her, by arriving at her door, complaining her car was stuck behind the wooded clearing at the back of the property, and Meg had walked to Ned's farmhouse for help, as of course it was the nearest house. She was practicing her words as if reciting a script she needed to learn off by heart for a theatrical production, but nothing intimidated Meg. She could be quite the actress when the need arose. Meg was convinced she could pull this off seamlessly. Besides, it was a believable enough story, as people helped each other out in this part of the world. And as to why she was driving around at the late hours of the night, she could claim she was looking for her lost cat, that one of the townsfolk had spotted on the road close to Ned's farmhouse, even though she didn't own one, but the woman didn't know that. She could only hope that the woman had not invited Eddie Tanner to stay over and spend the night with her. But if that was the case, it didn't matter, even though she knew Eddie Tanner would ultimately be on to her and not buy her fictitious story about her car engine seizing up. Eddie Tanner knew she was a town snoop, but he was hardly going to disclose this information to a woman he'd only just met for their very first date. Even if the tiresome Eddie Tanner was there, she would still consummately worm her way into Ned's farmhouse and ask this woman a host of questions, and ask them she would. Meg knew that her husband would never allow her to leave her property at night, especially in her current physical condition. But that was not a problem as far as Meg was concerned. She had her tricks up her sleeve. She'd slip a sleeping pill into his drink when he wasn't watching, and he'd be out like a light. It always worked like a charm every time. Before long, Reuben Riley was lying fast asleep on their couch, snoring loudly. She covered him with a blanket. He looked rather like their old, rather ungainly bulldog Gandalf when he was alive. Maybe they don't say dogs are like their owners for nothing, as Reuben looked like the human version of Gandalf, except thankfully his tongue wasn't sticking out of his mouth like Gandalf's had done, because that would not be an endearing look on her husband. She kissed him on the cheek and whispered, "Sorry, sweetheart, but a girl's got to do what a girl's got to do." But her husband's response was a long, drawn-out snort. Meg smiled triumphantly to herself, fully satisfied that now was the quintessential opportunity for her to escape the house, and she felt oddly excited about the prospect of leaving a home that had become like a prison to her of late. She was feeling slightly woozy, but the recent paracetamol she had taken would help her feel halfway normal again by bringing down her temperature. When she closed the front door discreetly behind her, the cold air of early May nudged her cheeks, causing her to shiver, but she was dressed warmly in her jeans, a sweatshirt, and her Canada Goose Alliston Parker, along with a pair of sneakers. She climbed into her car, started up the engine, opening up the garage doors with a remote control, and then left her home, driving away into the night with a great purpose. The uncongenial, friendless, starless night was unusually dark and rather hostile, as even the moonlight had denied its purpose and had refused to make any kind of appearance. Meg left the lights of the town and found herself heading down the backcountry roads towards Ned's old farmhouse. The trouble was Ned's farmhouse was situated on those sequestered, rather remote country roads that were less than agreeable to navigate at this late time of the night. But there was one thing about Meg that most people in town knew about her, and that was she was never overawed or daunted by anything, and was as tenacious as that rambling ivy that grows manically over everything it touches with very little encouragement. Meg could feel the familiar exhilaration welling up in her chest. She felt like a naughty schoolgirl who had been grounded by her parents and had broken out of her bedroom in the dead of night. One thing was for sure, that if Reuben knew what she was up to, he would be less than amused, but what he didn't know would never ever hurt him. Soon Meg found herself at the wooded clearing, not far from Ned's farmhouse, and she parked her car very discreetly behind a couple of lofty trees. She could not be seen from the road, and she sat in the car and waited. Her timing was meticulously perfect, as moments later the familiar sound of a car jolting down the road grabbed her attention. Through the tree she recognized the Tanner Brothers plumber's truck. Good, she thought. He was giving the new stranger in town a lift home. Now was the time for Meg to strike while the iron was hot, with her cock and bull story at the ready. Meg surreptitiously climbed out of her car, making as little noise as possible, feeling ever so slightly giddy on her feet, as she teetered through the trees rather awkwardly, like an unstable, ungainly, inebriated drunk. Her body was abruptly warning her that she clearly was not fit enough to endure this nightly adventure, but Meg did not care. She pulled out the thick wad of tissues from her pocket in her parka and blew her nose furiously hard, and then began to cough and splutter for a few minutes, her forehead becoming so hot and clammy that beads of perspiration began breaking out above her brow. But Meg wiped them away with her tissue, and proceeded undaunted on her way through the trees, using the torch she'd brought along with her to see her way clearly. The lofty congregation of trees swaggered in the wind, whistling and howling, their branches wobbling precariously, but Meg noticed none of this. She did not observe the sounds of the crickets or frogs. She did not notice the absence of moonlight failing to filter through the trees, nor did she observe the tall, ambiguous, lofty figure observing her as she trekked down the earthen path, with only one focus on her mind, and that was to get to Ned's farmhouse. All of a sudden, Meg began to get incredibly hot. The rising heat prickled up her back, travelling indiscriminately up her chest and all over her face. She was incredibly hot. This time she began to sweat like a pig, felt disorientated, befuddled and confused. Her eyes became bleary, and everything around her began to spin, so that she was beginning to see dots. Meg began to reach out for something to steady herself, but she ended up blacking out onto the ground. Moments later she opened her eyes to find this tall, dark creature that reminded her of King Kong, only his face was so human, staring down at her, trying to slap her face. Meg was certain she was delirious. She had to be. She should never have come out here tonight. She wasn't well. Her husband was right about that. What kind of bizarre, outlandish dream was this? Meg closed her eyes tightly and opened them again. The creature was still there, standing over her, slapping her face. But when Meg opened her eyes, she was so afraid by this huge, ambiguous thing standing over her that was titanic in size and girth and weight, and was the scariest thing she'd ever beheld. She let out an ear-piercing scream, and then fainted. Back at Ned's farmhouse, Sinead was fussing over the hob at the old range oven, where the kettle was boiling away. Eddie had made himself very comfortable at the kitchen table, and was tactlessly pointing out the things in the kitchen that needed fixing.
There's a lot of work to be done here. You can see those tiles there need regrouting. And this floor, well, it's in a bad way.
Oh, I know, said Sinead, shaking her head as she pulled the boiling kettle off the hob, and proceeded to pour the boiling water into 2 separate mugs. Maybe I have bitten off more than I can chew, she admitted. The kitchen is very tired looking. Just about everything here needs replacing.
Not necessarily, said Eddie encouragingly. I mean these terracotta tiles, for example. Yes, I agree, they look tired. But I assure you, with some polishing and buffing, they'll be as good as brand new. And these kitchen cupboards over here, well, they're made from excellent wood. They don't make cupboards like this anymore, you know. With some sanding and repainting, if you remove this dated olive green colour and paint them white, they could look very fetching indeed.
I do believe you're right, said Sinead, handing Eddie his mug of coffee, and sitting herself opposite him around the kitchen table. It was then the couple heard the sound of a woman screaming.
Did you hear that sound?
Said Eddie, looking at Sinead earnestly. For a brief moment an expression of concern dappled his forehead, but then after a few seconds he visibly seemed to relax. She nodded, looking at Eddie through wide eyes. Do you think someone's in trouble out there?
Eddie shrugged. I hope not. I don't think so. Let's just say over the years I've got used to strange noises coming from the wood grove. It happens a lot. Sometimes the wailing sounds can be coyotes, wolves, or even geese, believe it or not. It's probably not something to worry about. It's probably not human at all. You know, it's easy to overreact when you live out here in the countryside. And imagine the very worst. You'll soon learn all about that. Believe me, when I was a little boy, I thought the headless horseman was galloping through those woods. Let's just say the power of suggestion can wreak havoc on an impressionable person. You are bound to be more spooked out here than most, given that you lived in Los Angeles for a long time. You're used to the sounds of the traffic, not the strange sounds of the woodgrove at night. But you'll get used to it, I'm sure.
You're probably right, said Sinead, looking relieved at Eddie's reassuring words that offered her much solace. I guess moving out here is going to be harder than I anticipated. I mean, it was so dark out there tonight. Absolutely no moonlight at all. And that screaming sound, it sent chills down my spine. You forget I'm an author, so I've got a highly tuned imagination. If I didn't, I wouldn't be any good at what I do.
It looks like you might need me to move in with you, said Eddie, giving her a cheeky grin. To protect you, of course, from the noises out there.
Oh, I'm not that desperate, she said teasingly. It'll take more than screaming from the woodgrove for me to beg you to stay, Eddie. The couple continued to talk about what needed to be done at the farmhouse, when all of a sudden Sinead's face went as white as a sheet, the colour draining from her skin. She began to point at the window.
Is everything all right, Sinead? Eddie asked her. You look like, well, not very well all of a sudden.
I think I don't know if I'm going completely mad, came the wobbling voice. I think I've just seen a huge face at the window, a face with yellow eyes. I think it was waving its hand at me. Oh my God, she said, throwing her arms above her head. There was something out there. Something was out there, I know. It was looking in at us. It was the face of a monster.
Eddie grinned. I think I should remind you, Sinead, that you had over 3 margaritas in town. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there. I assure you, there's no face at the window. I'm sure it's the alcohol deceiving your brain. Eddie got to his feet. I think it's my cue to go, Sinead. I'll call you in the morning. You look dog-tired, if you don't mind my saying. I think I should leave you and love you. I've really enjoyed myself this evening, and if you're game, I would like to see you again very much. I think there's something between us, but I would like to take it slow and see where it finally goes. I will be straight with you, Sinead. I haven't felt a connection with another woman like this before. It kind of scares me, but I think you felt it too.
Sinead nodded her face, blushing a bright pink colour. Me too. I think there is a spark between us. And I like you a lot, Eddie. I really didn't expect that to happen. You're not my type.
Not your type? Asked Eddie incredulously. That's a first. I'm usually every woman's type.
It's not that. It's just that you're exceptionally good-looking, Eddie. And usually good-looking men, well, they rarely ever float my boat. It's not me being mean. It's just my experience with men who have film star-like looks. Usually their personalities are as flat as a beach ball that has lost all its gas. They don't have to work on their personalities, you see, so they're much more shallow, less interesting. But you're different, so I'm pleasantly surprised about that. And yes, I'd like to see you again, and see where this goes. It was at that moment they heard a loud banging against the eaves of the house, as well as a series of loud taps at the window. This time it was Eddie's turn to grow as white as a sheet.
What the hell?
He suddenly grew quite alarmed, for the banging was so intrusively loud that the whole house juddered and shook under its powerful vibration. Something with a brute force had shaken the house. But what could have done that? I told you, said Sinead, her face paling again, her heart banging so loudly it was slamming against the wall of her chest. There was something out there. I told you there was. Whatever it is, it's very big. I saw the face staring at me from the window. It was indicating to me.
Have you got a rifle? Eddie asked Sinead.
Over there, said Sinead, handing over her uncle's old hunting rifle.
Eddie took it.
I'm not sure you should go out there, she advised. The banging persisted, but Eddie bravely opened the front door, his rifle armed at the ready. And that was when they both saw it. A large Bigfoot stood outside the front door, cradling a woman in his arms. Both Eddie and Sinead stared at this ambiguous, lofty creature in wondrous awe, wondering what they were seeing. Was it really real? Or had they really overindulged in the alcohol this evening? The creature's body was lit up by the powerful outside light, and the humongous size of him took their breath away. He stood up on 2 feet, easily over 9 foot tall, covered in long flowing dark hair, his face incredibly human, with a furrowed forehead, flat nose, and deep-set dark eyes. In the beginning Sinead was very fearful. She thought her feet were going to crumble beneath her, and that she was going to collapse and pass out on the floor. But a powerful voice boomed into her head.
Don't be afraid. I'm not going to harm you. This woman needs your help. She's very sick. She's burning up with a fever.
When the creature's eyes held hers, Sinead's heart melted like chocolate. The Bigfoot's eyes were the kindest eyes she had ever beheld. Eddie felt it too, because he stepped away to let the Bigfoot into the house. Sinead led him to the spare bedroom, and the Bigfoot placed the woman on the bed. He then spoke to them in a booming voice, in a strange indigenous language that for some bizarre reason Eddie and Sinead perfectly understood. Milaticanicua, holinatilacan, homokoshakisana, halinatolokwa. She will be fine. Keep her warm. Give her plenty of fluids. In 4 days' time she will be fully recovered. And with that, he trotted out of the house and was gone. Oh my God! Did that just happen? Sinead asked Eddie. Or am I completely bladdered? I've got to be bladdered. That didn't just happen. A Bigfoot walked into our house with a strange woman. Are we going mad? Did that happen?
It happened, said Eddie.
Who the hell is the woman? Said Sinead, feeling the woman's head when she entered the room. Oh my God! The creature's right. She's burning up. She's got a dreadful fever.
I know who it is. It's Meg Riley. Everyone knows Meg Riley, said Eddie, grinning. She's the town gossip. She's been in bed with pneumonia under strict doctor's orders.
Well, what the hell is she doing here then?
Eddie shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly. It would seem, when you're a busybody like Meg Riley is, not even pneumonia is going to keep you down. My guess is she was here to find out all about you, but pegged out on the way to your front door. She's very sick, you can see.
Is she really that snoopy?
I'm afraid so, said Eddie, grinning.
So what is the end of this rather curious story? I'll tell you. It would seem that Meg was left to recoup at Ned's farmhouse until she finally went home, but she was able to inform the townsfolk all about the new stranger in town. Sinead did fix up the old farmhouse, and she currently lives there with Eddie Tanner, who is a reformed character these days, and the wandering eyes and Casanova spirit are a thing of the past. For it would seem Sinead is now his entire world, and when you find a good thing, you know better than to let it go. The couple are very happily married and have 2 children now, and have never seen the Bigfoot again, but they know he's out there, and that knowledge keeps them very secure. Sinead has written 2 more bestsellers and is very comfortable living in a remote North Carolina town. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.